"Kill the fat bastard," Snake Matthews sneered, pressing his Colt against the rancher's head. Those were his last words. The Laramie Gang had terrorized Wyoming Territory for 3 years, but they'd just made their final mistake. John "Bear" McCullough wasn't the soft rancher they saw. He was America's deadliest cavalry scout, with 200 Apache scalps to his name. They laughed at his weight as he stood in the dusty street. Never saw his hands move, never heard the shots, just watched their leader's head explode in a red mist. 7 days of bloodshed would follow, as the Laramie Gang learned why Army scouts were the most feared men on the frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. John "Bear" McCullough wiped sweat from his brow as he guided his wagon through Crow's Creek's dusty main street. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across weathered storefronts, and the usual crowd of cowboys and settlers parted before his heavily laden wagon. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered behind raised hands. "There goes Bear," he heard someone mutter, "getting fatter by the day." McCullough ignored them, just as he'd ignored similar comments for the past 5 years. Let them talk. Let them see what they wanted to see. A once powerful man gone soft, who'd traded his cavalry scouts' buckskins for a rancher's simple clothes. His considerable bulk shifted as the wagon hit a rut, and he adjusted his position on the hard wooden seat. Martha Tanner waved from her general store's porch. "Evening, Mr. McCullough. Got those supplies you ordered?" He pulled the wagon to a stop, climbing down with a grace that seemed at odds with his size. Most folks didn't notice that peculiarity, how a man carrying nearly 300 pounds could move so smoothly. They didn't see how his eyes constantly scanned the street, marking positions, noting faces, cataloguing potential threats. Old habits that had kept him alive through 15 years of frontier warfare. "Evening, Martha," he called back, his voice gentle despite its deep rumble. "Appreciate you holding them for me." Inside the store, Martha had his usual order ready. Flour, coffee, ammunition for his Winchester. She was one of the few who treated him with genuine warmness rather than barely concealed disdain. "Heard about any more trouble with the Laramie Gang?" he asked casually, counting out coins from his worn leather purse. Martha's face darkened. 3 more farms hit last week. Jenkins' family got it worst, burned their barn, beat poor Thomas half to death. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Sheriff's useless, too scared to do anything but write reports." McCullough nodded, his expression carefully neutral. But inside, something stirred. An old familiar feeling he'd tried to bury beneath years of peaceful ranching. He'd chosen this quiet life for a reason, sworn off violence after seeing too much death in the Apache wars. "Might be time someone did something about them," Martha added, watching his face carefully. "Might be," he agreed softly. "But I'm just a simple rancher now, Martha. Those fighting days are behind me." She snorted, glancing meaningfully at the Colt revolver, partially hidden beneath his coat. The same Colt he'd carried through 100 scout missions, though none in town knew that history. "Sure you are, Bear, sure you are." Loading the supplies took time, and the sun was setting as McCullough headed home to Shadow Valley Ranch. His property lay 5 miles outside town, 2,000 acres of good grazing land backed by towering cliffs. He'd chosen it carefully. Defensible terrain, clear lines of sight, multiple escape routes. Another habit he'd never quite shaken. The wagon crested the final rise, and McCullough felt some of his ever-present tension ease at the sight of home. The main house was solid stone and timber, built to his exact specifications. Barns and outbuildings formed a rough circle, protecting the central courtyard. Most thought it an odd layout for a cattle ranch. None realized it was essentially a military fort disguised as a peaceful homestead. His ranch hand, young Billy Carter, came running out to help with the wagon. The boy was another stray McCullough had taken in, like so many others, 17, smart and eager to learn. Any trouble, "In town, Mr. McCullough?" Billy asked, already unhitching the horses. "Quiet as always," McCullough replied. "Though Martha says the Laramie Gang's been busy." Billy's face hardened. His family's farm had been one of the gang's first targets when they moved into the territory. "Wish somebody would stand up to them. Wish I was man enough to do it myself." McCullough placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Fighting's not always the answer, son. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is walk away." But as he spoke those words, his eyes drifted to the locked chest in his private study, the one that held his old cavalry scout gear, the buckskins, the special rifles, the medals he'd earned tracking America's deadliest enemies through impossible terrain. 15 years of blood and violence, all locked away with his past. He'd chosen peace, chosen to become the fat rancher everyone saw, letting his hard-earned muscle turn to comfortable bulk. But as reports of the Laramie Gang's brutality increased, as more innocent families suffered while the law stood helpless, that old familiar itch returned, the urge to hunt, to track, to kill. McCullough shook off such thoughts and helped Billy stable the horses. But that night, as he sat on his wide porch watching the moon rise over Shadow Valley, his hand unconsciously traced the scar running down his left side, a reminder of his last Apache mission, the one that had finally convinced him to hang up his buckskins. He'd found peace here, built something good. But deep inside, where that old warrior spirit still burned, he knew it couldn't last. Sooner or later, trouble would find him. And when it did, the Laramie Gang would learn what Martha already suspected, that beneath the fat rancher's peaceful facade lay a warrior who'd never truly lost his edge. The deadly scout was still there, sleeping but not gone. And God help anyone who woke him up. That night, sleep eluded John McCullough. Martha's words about the Laramie Gang echoed in his mind, stirring memories he'd fought hard to forget. He sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, staring at the locked chest in the corner. Finally, after hours of internal struggle, he pulled the key from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The chest's hinges creaked in protest. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. The smell hit him first. Gun oil, leather, sage and desert dust that somehow still clung to the old buckskins. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted out the cavalry. Scout's uniform, fingers tracing the marks and tears that each told their own story. The moonlight caught the brass cavalry insignia, and suddenly he was back there, 15 years ago, tracking his first Apache war party through the Dragoon Mountains. "You'll never catch them," the cavalry captain had sneered at the young scout. 20 warriors on horseback, 6 hours head start. They're probably in Mexico by now. But John McCullough, lean and hard in those days, had just smiled. "They're running south, but they'll turn east at the river. These aren't young braves showing off. They're veteran warriors. They'll head for the old strongholds in the Chiricahuas." He'd been right. 3 days later, he led the cavalry straight to the Apache camp. Not a single warrior escaped. That mission made his reputation, earned him the name that would eventually become legend among both soldiers and Indians, the Ghost Who Walks. McCullough pulled another item from the chest, a brass spyglass, its leather casing worn smooth from years of use. The sight of it brought back the Sweetwater campaign. "Can't be done," Colonel Harrison had declared. 200 Apache warriors scattered across 50 miles of the worst terrain in the territory. We'd need 1,000 men to cover that much. "Ground, or one good scout," McCullough had replied quietly. For 6 weeks he'd tracked the scattered bands, moving like a ghost through the landscape, reading signs invisible to others. One by one, he'd located each group, allowing the cavalry to strike with precision. After that, even the Apache changed their tactics. They said he could see tracks 3 days old, could smell a cooking fire from 5 miles away, could shoot a man between the eyes at 400 yards. Some of those tales were exaggerated, some weren't. Deeper in the chest lay his most prized possession, a specially modified Henry rifle, crafted to his exact specifications. The weapon that had made him the deadliest shot in the Arizona Territory. Impossible shot, Lieutenant Parker had whispered as they lay on the ridge. Below, nearly 500 yards away, the renegade Chief Yellowknife sat by his fire, surrounded by 30 warriors. McCullough had taken careful aim with the Henry. No such thing as an impossible shot, Lieutenant, just impossible men. The single report had echoed through the canyon. Yellowknife's reign of terror ended that night, and the legend of the ghost who walks grew larger. McCullough's hands moved to the final item, a small leather pouch containing his most closely guarded secret. Inside lay 7 Apache arrowheads, each marked with a small notch. 7 times he'd been wounded badly enough that others would have died. 7 times he'd survived, each recovery making him more cautious, more deadly. The last one had nearly killed him. That final mission, the one that convinced him to retire, they're all dead, he'd reported to General Crook, blood still seeping from the wound in his side. 38 warriors. Won't be raiding any more settlements. And it only cost us. On scout patrol, the general had replied grimly, looking at the bodies of McCullough's 5 dead companions. That night, as the surgeons stitched him up, McCullough made his decision. He'd seen too much death, lost too many friends. It was time to find peace. The first light of dawn was creeping through the study windows. McCullough carefully repacked the chest, each item returning to its proper place. He'd chosen peace, chosen to let others see him as just a fat, aging rancher. But as he stood watching the sun rise over Shadow Valley, he knew the truth. The weight he'd gained hadn't slowed him down. If anything, it had made him more dangerous. Hidden beneath that bulk, his muscles were still iron-hard, his eyes still sharp, his hands still steady. The ghost who walks wasn't dead. He'd just been sleeping, and as he thought about the Laramie Gang, about Martha's words and the suffering they'd brought to honest folks, McCullough felt that old, familiar hunger stirring, the urge to hunt, to track, to kill. God help them if they ever come. Here, he whispered to the dawn, God help them if they wake the ghost. Dawn found McCullough already at work, moving through his daily routine with methodical precision. To casual observers, it looked like simple ranch work. None noticed how each task maintained the skills that had once made him legendary. Checking. The fence line kept his tracking sharp. He could read the story of every animal that had passed in the night. Roping cattle honed the hand-eye coordination that had made him the territory's deadliest shot. Even his apparently clumsy bulk masked the practiced movements of a predator. Billy watched from the barn as McCullough hefted heavy feed sacks, marveling at how the big man never seemed to tire. "Don't know how you do it, Mr. McCullough. Most men your size can't work half as hard." McCullough just smiled, but his mind flashed to countless miles tracked through Apache territory, carrying 100 pounds of gear through mountains that would break most men. The feed sacks were nothing compared to that. "Practice, son," he replied. "Just takes practice." The morning passed quietly until Widow Sarah Jensen rode in, her face tight with worry. McCullough had been helping her run her small spread since her husband died last winter. She was a proud woman, not given to asking for help easily. "Troubles?" McCullough asked, noting how her hand trembled slightly on the reins. "Riders came by yesterday," she said softly. 4 men. Said they represented some protection company. Wanted payment to keep my place safe." Her lip curled in disgust. "When I refused, they said accidents happen to stubborn widows." McCullough's face remained neutral, but something cold stirred in his chest. "The Laramie Gang?" "Didn't say, but who else? They're coming back tomorrow for their answer." She straightened in her saddle. "I won't pay them, Bear. Tom and I built that ranch from nothing. I'll die before I let bandits take it." "No one's dying," McCullough said quietly. He glanced at the position of the sun, making rapid calculations. "Billy, fetch my brown mare. Mrs. Jensen, I'll ride back with you. Check your fences. Might be wolves about." They both knew he wasn't talking about wolves. The ride to Jensen's ranch took an hour. McCullough used the time to study the terrain with a scout's eye, noting approaches, possible ambush points, lines of sight. Sarah's small house sat exposed on a rise, defensible but vulnerable to anyone who knew what they were doing. "They'll come from the north," he said, pointing to a shallow draw. "Good cover, easy approach. That's how I'd do it." Sarah looked at him sharply, catching the shift in his voice. For a moment, she glimpsed something beneath the peaceful rancher's facade, something hard and deadly. McCullough spent the afternoon making subtle preparations. He showed Sarah's ranch hand how to wolf-proof the corrals, but the sharpened stakes and tripwires weren't meant for wolves. While checking the rot in her barn's roof, he established clear fields of fire covering every approach. "Might want to sleep at our place tonight," he suggested casually. "Billy's sister's visiting, could use some female company." Sarah wasn't fooled. "They're coming tonight, aren't they? Not tomorrow?" McCullough nodded. "Tonight makes more sense. Less chance of witnesses, and you'll be here waiting." It wasn't a question. "Just keeping an eye out for wolves, ma'am. Nothing more." But as he rode home that evening, McCullough felt the familiar pre-battle tension building. He'd set up the ground exactly as he wanted, prepared his kill zone with the same precision that had served him against the Apache. Now came the waiting. After sunset, he made a show of riding back to his ranch, taking the main trail where anyone watching would see him. 2 miles out, he doubled back through the broken country only a scout could navigate in darkness. By midnight, he was in position above Sarah's ranch, watching through the moonlight. They came at 2 in the morning, just as he'd predicted. 4 riders, moving with the confidence of men who thought they held all the cards. McCullough's experienced eye noted their military-style formation. These weren't common bandits. Someone had trained them. He could have shot them easily from ambush. The old Henry rifle was in his hands, its familiar weight promising swift death. But he needed to know more, needed to understand what he was truly dealing with. So he watched, cold and patient as a mountain cat, as they approached the empty ranch house. Watched them kick in the door, heard their angry shouts at finding no one inside, memorized faces, voices, details that would help him track them later. Only when they began setting fire to Sarah's barn did he move. 1 shot, 1 man down before. They knew they were under attack. The others scattered like quail, shooting blindly into the darkness. McCullough's second shot took another rider from his saddle. The remaining 2 showed their training, making a coordinated break for the draw. He let them go, let them carry word back to their leaders about the ambush, about how Tom Baker and Clay Wilson died without ever seeing their killer. Dawn found him erasing all sign of the night's work. He buried the bodies deep where they'd never be found, scattered the horses to look like a random stampede. To anyone tracking backward, it would appear the 2 men had simply vanished on their way to threaten a widow. When Sarah returned later that morning, only the scorched corner of her barn showed anything had happened. She looked at the burn marks, then at McCullough's carefully blank face. "Wolves can be dangerous creatures," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, "but proper preparation usually keeps them away." But as he rode home, McCullough knew he'd crossed a line. The fat rancher's mask had cracked, allowing the deadly scout to emerge, and once that happened, there was no going back. The Laramie Gang would come looking for their missing men, would eventually trace them back to Shadow Valley, and when they did, they'd find something far more dangerous than a simple rancher waiting for them. The ghost who walks was awake again, and he was already hunting. Snake Matthews sat in the Silver Dollar Saloon, his cold eyes studying the crude map spread before him. Around the table, His lieutenants waited in tense silence as their leader traced potential routes through Shadow Valley. 2 men missing. He growled, 2 of my best, vanished while working the Jensen widow's place. His finger stabbed at the map, right here, in this valley, where that fat rancher McCullough lives. Jake, the butcher. Thompson cleared his throat. Could be coincidence, boss. Lots of old army men settled in these parts after the Indian Wars. No coincidence, Snake replied. Baker and Wilson were professionals, 20 years riding with Confederate raiders, then the border gangs. Men like that don't just disappear. He stood, pacing the private room with predatory grace. At 45, Snake Matthews was lean and hard as drought-cured leather. 3 decades of violence had left scars visible and hidden, but they'd also honed him into something deadly. Tell me about this McCullough again. The butcher consulted. A dirty notebook. Been here 5 years. Runs about 2,000 head of cattle. Keeps to himself mostly. Some kind of army background, but nothing special. Just got fat and soft like they all do. Snake's eyes narrowed. That army background, you're sure it was nothing special? Regular cavalry, from what folks say. Nobody important. Then why's he got his place set up like a fort? Snake pulled out another map. This one showing Shadow Valley Ranch in detail. Look at these building positions, these lines of sight. This ain't no regular ranch setup. A newcomer might have questioned how the gang leader knew military fortifications. None of his men did. They'd all heard stories about Snake's time with Quantrill's raiders during the war, learning tactics that made him more than just another bandit. Check the property records again, he ordered. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with. 3 days later, the gang gathered in force at their hidden camp in the Medicine Bow Mountains. 30 hard men, the core of Snake's operation, waited to hear his plan for taking Shadow Valley. Territory's changing, Snake began, his voice carrying to every man. Railroads coming, cities growing. Soon there won't be room for men like us. He spat into the fire. Unless we take what we want now, establish ourselves proper-like. The men nodded. They'd been hitting farms and ranches systematically, building their grip on the territory piece by piece. Shadow Valley was the key to controlling the whole region. McCullough's soft, Snake continued. 5 years of easy living made him weak. But he's still got soldier's instincts. That makes him dangerous. Means we do this right. He laid out his plan, developed with the same tactical precision he'd learned during the war. 10 men would approach from the north, making a show of force. Meanwhile, the main group would circle through the high country, coming in from the cliffs everybody thought were impassable. We take the ranch, make an example of McCullough, Snake finished. Show everybody what happens to folks who stand against us. Nobody mentioned Baker and Wilson's disappearance, but everybody was thinking about it. They moved out at dawn, the gang splitting into their assigned groups. Snake rode with the main force, studying the terrain with professional eyes. Something about this whole situation bothered him, but he couldn't put his finger on what. The first sign of trouble came when his scouts reported finding tripwires and pit traps along the cliff approach. Crude stuff, but placed with tactical understanding, like somebody who knew exactly how an attacking force would move. Getting worried about a fat rancher, Snake? The butcher asked, noting his leader's frown. Not worried, just careful. Snake studied the valley through his spyglass. Man doesn't survive 30 years of fighting by underestimating anybody. By noon, they'd worked their way into position. The ranch buildings lay below them, seemingly peaceful in the summer heat. Snake watched McCullough moving heavily between the barn and house, completely unaware of the forces gathering around him. But something still needled at Snake's instincts. The rancher's movements, while appearing clumsy, covered ground with efficient purpose. Every few minutes, he'd pause in his work, scanning the ridgelines in a pattern Snake recognized from his own military days. Check those property records again, he ordered suddenly. What exactly did they say about his army service? The butcher fumbled with his notebook. Here it is. John McCullough served with the 3rd Cavalry out of Fort. He never finished. Snake had gone deathly pale, the spyglass slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. "The 3rd Cavalry," he whispered. "Out of Fort Bowie, during the Apache Wars." Old memories surfaced, stories that had drifted up from Arizona Territory years ago. Stories about a scout they called the Ghost Who Walks. "God help us," Snake breathed. "We've been hunting the wrong man, but it was too late. The trap was already closing." McCullough had known they were there for hours. A circling hawk, a subtle shift in the wind carrying horse scent, tracks that appeared too deliberately casual, all signs clear as shouting to a man who'd spent 15 years reading the deserts. Secrets. He maintained his active ignorance, moving between buildings with apparent clumsiness, while mentally marking every enemy position. 32 men total, split into 3 groups. The main force hiding in the supposedly impassable cliffs, a smaller group north near the creek, and scouts scattered along the ridgeline. Professional deployment, military thinking. This Snake Matthews was no common bandit. Inside the barn, Billy tensed as McCullough entered. The boy had begged to stay and fight, and McCullough had agreed, with conditions. "Remember what I told you," McCullough said softly, checking his rifle one final time. "You fire only if they reach the house. Otherwise, you stay hidden no matter what you see or hear." "Yes, sir." Billy's voice shook slightly. "But there's so many of them." McCullough smiled, and for the first time, Billy saw beneath the peaceful rancher's mask. Saw something that made him deeply grateful this man was on his side. "Numbers don't matter, son. The Apache taught me that. One ghost can be more dangerous than an army if he knows his ground and chooses his moment." A horse's nervous whinny drifted down from the cliffs. McCullough's smile turned predatory. Time to introduce them to the ghost. He moved out into the yard, still playing his role. But his seemingly random wandering had brought every hidden enemy exactly where he wanted them. Now, one final piece. "Mr. McCullough!" The shout came from the North Creek. 10 riders emerged, led by a scarred man McCullough recognized from wanted posters. "Jake the Butcher Thompson." "Can I help you, boys?" McCullough called back, letting anxiety creep into his voice. "That depends." The butcher rode closer, openly contemptuous of the fat rancher before him. "We're looking for 2 of our friends. Went missing round these parts a few days back." "Ain't seen any strangers," McCullough replied, backing away slightly. "Don't want any trouble." "Too bad. Trouble's found you anyway." The butcher drew his revolver, and everything changed. Later, survivors would swear McCullough moved faster than humanly possible. One moment he was backing away, awkward and afraid. The next, his right hand flickered, just flickered, and the butcher's head exploded in a red mist. Before the body hit the ground, McCullough was moving. 2 more riders died in the first 3 seconds, their shots going wild as the supposedly clumsy rancher flowed like quicksilver between their bullets. The remaining northerners broke, trying to retreat. McCullough's rifle spoke 5 more times. 5 more bodies fell. On the cliffs, Snake Matthews watched in horror as his diversion force was systematically destroyed. He'd seen men fight before, seen the best gunmen of the border wars. This was different. This was ghost, he whispered. Sweet Jesus, the stories were true. McCullough reached the barn in a smooth roll, just as the main force opened fire from the cliffs. But they were shooting at shadows. The fat, slow rancher had vanished, replaced by something that seemed to flow through the war-torn landscape like water through sand. 3 more gang members died in the next minute, picked off with inhuman precision from angles that seemed impossible. Each shot was carefully placed. No warnings, no injuries, just instant death. Snake's men were professionals, hardened by years of battle, but they were used to fighting ordinary men. This was like trying to shoot smoke. "Pull back!" Snake roared. Everybody pulled back to the high ground. Too late. McCullough had worked his way into the rocks, using paths only an Apache scout would know existed. The gang's carefully planned attack had turned into a slaughter. More shots rang out, more men fell. Some died, never knowing where the bullets came from. Others had just enough time to see a shadow move, a ghost that killed without mercy or hesitation. When it ended, 13 of Snake's best men lay dead. The others had scattered into the hills, all thought of taking the ranch forgotten in their desperate flight. Snake Matthews sat on his horse, surrounded by 4 of his surviving lieutenants, and stared down at Shadow Valley. Somewhere down there, the ghost who had just destroyed half his gang was waiting, watching. "What do we do now, boss?" one of his men whispered. Snake's face hardened. He'd spent 30 years building his reputation, gathering hard men to his banner. He couldn't let one old scout ruin everything. "We come back," he growled. "With every man we can hire, every gun we can buy. We're going to burn that valley and everyone in it." But as they rode away, Snake couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost was still watching, still hunting. And when the time came, all the men and guns in the territory wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. Down in the valley, McCullough emerged from the rocks. His movements were once again slow, deliberate, but now there was no mistaking the lethal grace beneath his bulk. The ghost had awakened fully, and there would be no going back to sleep. Billy came running out of the house, eyes wide at the carnage. "Mr. McCullough, I've never seen anything like that. The way you moved." "They'll be back," McCullough cut him off, "with more men, more guns." He gazed up at the cliffs where Snake Matthews had vanished. "Time to remind them why they used to call me the ghost who walks." That night, McCullough moved through Shadow Valley like a ghost, erasing all signs of the battle. Each body was buried deep where it would never be found, their horses scattered to look like random strays. By dawn, only bullet holes in the barn. Walls testified to the morning's slaughter. But inside, something had changed. The carefully constructed peace of the past 5 years lay shattered, and the ghost had fully awakened. In his study, McCullough opened a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, larger than the chest that held his scout gear. Inside lay everything he'd need for what was coming: ammunition, medical supplies, weapons collected over 15 years of warfare. "Didn't expect to use these again," he muttered, lifting out specially modified revolvers. Each had been crafted to his exact specifications during the Apache Wars. Perfect balance, hair triggers, deadly accurate at ranges that would make most men's shots impossible. Billy watched from the doorway as McCullough laid out his arsenal. "Those aren't regular guns, are they, sir?" "No." McCullough's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each weapon. "These are ghost guns, special tools for special work." He spent the morning preparing, following routines burned into his memory by years of combat. Each bullet was examined, each weapon cleaned and loaded with mechanical precision. His movements had changed. No trace remained of the clumsy rancher's facade. "They'll come at night next time," he explained to Billy as they fortified the ranch house. 3, maybe 4 days to gather men. Snake Matthews won't risk another daylight attack. "How can you be sure?" "Because it's what I do." McCullough's eyes swept the valley with cold calculation. "He's got good tactical instincts, military training. Problem is, I've spent 15 years learning how to counter every strategy he might try." They worked systematically, turning the ranch into a killing ground. Hidden pits lined with sharp stakes, tripwires connected to shotgun traps, every approach covered by interlocking fields of fire. "Learning this stuff from the Apache?" Billy asked, helping dig another pit, learning how to counter it. McCullough's voice was distant, lost in memory. "They were masters of this kind of warfare. Took me years to understand their methods, more years to learn how to beat them at their own game." By afternoon, Sarah Jensen rode in, leading 3 pack horses loaded with supplies. Her face was grim as she surveyed the preparations. "Word's spreading," she reported. "Snake's offering $5,000 to any gunman willing to join his crew. Sent riders to every hellhole and hideout in 3 territories. McCullough nodded, unsurprised. How many you figure? 30, 40 more guns at least, plus what's left of his original. Gang, she hesitated. Bear, that's a lot of men. Numbers don't matter. He was checking sightlines from the upper windows, marking ranges. More men just means more targets. But that night, alone in his study, McCullough faced harder truths. The peaceful man he'd tried to become warred with the awakened ghost. 5 years of quiet ranching had dulled some skills he'd need sharp for what was coming. He moved to the barn, setting up targets at varying ranges. For hours, he drilled with rifle and revolvers, pushing himself to recapture the deadly speed and accuracy that had made him legend. Miss, another miss, a third shot that would have only wounded. Cursing softly, he reloaded. The guns felt strange. In his thickened fingers, his added weight threw off familiar rhythms of movement. Having trouble? He spun, guns appearing in his hands with blinding speed. Sarah stood in the doorway, unafraid. Still too slow, he growled, holstering the revolvers. Too rusty. Looked plenty fast to me. Fast enough for regular men. Not fast enough for what's coming. He turned back to the targets. Snake will bring professionals, men who kill for a living, can't afford to be anything but perfect. Sarah watched him drill for another hour, each shot bringing him closer to his former deadly precision. You've done this before, haven't you? Prepared for a siege like this? Once. Apache renegades had me pinned in a box canyon. 40 warriors against 1 scout. His voice grew distant. Took them 3 days to work, up the courage to attack. By then, I'd turned that canyon into a death trap. Only 6 survived to tell the story. And that's why they called you the ghost? One of the reasons. He finally turned to face her. Sarah, you should leave. Take Billy and go somewhere safe. What's coming? It won't be like this morning. It'll be war. She met his gaze steadily. This is my home too, Bear. I'm not running. McCullough nodded, recognizing the iron in her spine. Then we do this right. Starting tomorrow, I teach you both everything I know about surviving a siege. He worked them mercilessly over the next 2 days. Taught them Apache fighting techniques, how to move unseen, how to kill silently. Showed them the deadly skills he'd spent 15 years perfecting. Billy proved a natural, absorbing the lethal knowledge with frightening speed. Sarah was slower but determined, turning her widow's rage into cold purpose. But at night, when they'd collapsed exhausted into bed, McCullough continued his own preparation. Hours of weapons drill, pushing his body to remember its old deadly grace. The fat began to melt away, revealing the hard muscle beneath. Each morning, he ran the ridgelines, rebuilding his stamina. Each afternoon, he refined the valley's defenses, adding layers of subtle traps that would funnel attackers exactly where he wanted them. The ghost was fully awake now, and the peaceful rancher's facade lay discarded like an old coat. John McCullough had spent 5 years trying to forget his violent past. Now he embraced it, letting the cold killer's instincts rise to the surface. Snake Matthews and his army of gunmen were coming. But they wouldn't find a fat rancher waiting for them. They'd find the ghost, and this time he wasn't interested in taking prisoners. On the 3rd day, Marshal David Harker rode into Shadow Valley, dust coating his once fine uniform. At 55, the lawman looked older than his years, badge hanging heavy on a chest that had once been proud but now sagged with defeat. His eyes widened at the sight of the fortifications transforming McCullough's peaceful ranch. "Jesus, Bear," he said, dismounting stiffly. "You preparing for the second coming?" McCullough paused in his work, setting down the roll of barbed wire. He'd been stretching across the northern approach. Sarah and Billy continued their tasks, moving with the focused efficiency he'd drilled into them. "Something like that," McCullough replied. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Inside the kitchen, Harker removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. His hand trembled slightly as he accepted the steaming cup. "I heard rumors," the marshal began, voice low, "about what happened 3 days ago. 13 men disappeared without a trace. Snake Matthews' men." McCullough's face revealed nothing. "Dangerous country. Men disappear all the time." "Not like this." Harker leaned forward. "I've got witnesses saying they heard gunfire from this direction. Lots of it. Hunting season. In July?" The marshal shook his head. "Bear, I've known you 5 years. Always struck me as a peaceable man. But lately, stories are spreading about your past, about your time with the 3rd Cavalry." McCullough sipped his coffee. "Just stories." "Are they?" Harker's tired eyes fixed on him. "Because I sent some telegrams after hearing those rumors. Got some interesting replies from Arizona Territory." Silence stretched between them. Outside, Sarah called instructions to Billy as they set another trap. "The ghost who walks," Harker finally said. "That's what the Apache called you, wasn't it? Military records say you were just a scout, but other accounts—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "What do you want, David?" McCullough asked, voice hardening. "I want to prevent a war." The marshal set down his cup with a sharp click. "Snakes gathering an army in Crow's Creek. 30 professional gunmen at last count, with more arriving daily. He's offering top dollar for anyone willing to help burn you out. Let them come." "Damn it, Bear," Harker slapped the table. "This isn't the frontier anymore. We've got laws, courts, procedures, and how well have those worked against the Laramie Gang so far?" McCullough's voice remained calm, but his eyes had gone cold. "How many farms burned while you wrote reports? How many families terrorized while you waited for judges and warrants?" The marshal flinched as if struck. "I'm doing what I can with what I've got. 1 deputy, no support from the territorial governor, and gangs with more men and guns than I. Good hope to match. Then you understand my position perfectly." Harker sighed, shoulders slumping. "I'm not here to arrest you, Bear, or judge you. I'm here to warn you." He looked up, fear plain in his weathered face. "This isn't just about Snake anymore. Word's spreading through every outlaw den within 500 miles. They're saying a legend has resurfaced, a ghost from the Apache Wars. They're coming to see if the stories are true." "Good." McCullough's voice had dropped to a whisper. "Let them all come. You don't understand." Harker stood, pacing the kitchen agitatedly. "These aren't just the usual border trash. Snake's hired professionals, men like Clay Allison, John, Wesley Hardin." For the first time, McCullough showed surprise. "Hardin's in Texas." "Not anymore." $5,000 cash pulled him north. The marshal ran a hand through his hair. "These are killers, Bear. Men with 20, 30 notches on their guns, and they're all coming here." McCullough rose slowly, his bulk no longer hiding the predator beneath. "You think that scares me, David? I hunted Apache warriors who could kill any of these so-called gunfighters before they cleared leather. Men who made outlaws like Hardin look like amateurs." He moved to the window, staring out at the valley he'd come to love. "For 15 years, I tracked the deadliest warriors on the frontier, learned their ways, became something that even they feared." His voice dropped lower. "These gunmen? They're just men. Men bleed. Men die. And what about innocent people caught in the crossfire?" Harker demanded. "This isn't just about you anymore. What happens when Snake can't get to you here? What happens when he starts burning? Farms, killing families to draw you out?" That struck home. McCullough's jaw tightened. "What are you suggesting?" "Leave." Harker spread his hands. "Just for a while. Give me time to wire the governor again, request federal marshals. We can do this legally, Bear, the right way. And while I'm gone, while you're waiting for telegrams and marshals who may never come, what happens to Sarah's place, to the other small ranchers who can't defend themselves?" The marshal had no answer. McCullough walked to a cabinet, unlocking it to reveal a bottle of fine Kentucky bourbon he saved for special occasions. He poured 2 glasses, sliding one to Harker. "I tried it your way, David. For 5 years, I've been a peaceful man. Followed the laws, trusted the system." He tossed back the whiskey in one swallow. "But some men only understand one language. Violence, justice," McCullough corrected. "Swift and final." Harker drained his glass, grimacing. "Then God help us all." He moved to the door, settling his hat. "I've got a job to do, Bear. I can't sanction what's coming, but—" he hesitated. "I won't stand in your way either." "Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm failing my oath either way." He paused at the threshold. "Just remember something. These aren't Apache warriors. These are white men. Kill too many, and it won't matter who was right or wrong. They'll hang you regardless." After the marshal rode out, McCullough returned to his work with renewed purpose. Sarah found him checking rifles on the upper floor. "What did the marshal want?" she asked. "To warn me? To stop me?" He continued his methodical inspection. "Doesn't matter. It matters if they'll hang you after." McCullough paused, meeting her concerned gaze. "Only if they catch me." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, he took Billy to a high point overlooking the approaches from Crow's Creek. "If things go wrong," he instructed, "if the ranch falls, you take Sarah and ride south through Devil's Pass. It's a hidden trail only Apache scouts know about. Follow it to Fort Richardson. Ask for Colonel James Porter. Tell him the ghost called in his marker." Billy nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." Then hesitantly, "But nothing's going to go wrong, right? You can handle whatever comes?" McCullough stared toward the distant town where killers were gathering. Tomorrow or the next day, they would come. Professionals, men who had built their reputations on speed and accuracy with a gun. "I'm not the man I was," he admitted quietly. 5 years is a long time. I'm older, slower." He turned to the boy. "But they're making one mistake. Same mistake the Apache made." "What's that?" "They think this is about shooting, about who's fastest with a gun." The ghost's cold smile appeared. "But that's not how I survived 15 years of frontier warfare." "How did you survive?" McCullough's eyes grew distant. "By understanding that the most dangerous predator isn't the one that roars loudest or moves fastest." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's the one that's patient, the one that prepares, the one that's already decided exactly how you're going to die before you even know you're being hunted." In town, the killers were drinking, boasting, preparing for tomorrow's easy victory against an aging, fat rancher. None of them understood. They were already in the ghost's trap. That every route they might take, every strategy they might employ, had already been anticipated and countered. "Let them come," McCullough whispered to the gathering darkness. "The valley is ready." Crow's Creek had never seen anything like it. The small frontier town, usually home to ranchers, storekeepers, and the occasional drummer, now overflowed with killers. They crowded the saloons, filled the boarding houses, and camped on the outskirts. Men with cold eyes and quick hands, drawn by the promise of easy money and the chance to test themselves against a legend. Snake Matthews sat in his private room above the silver dollar, tallying the growing force. 47 professional gunmen, plus his remaining gang members, rifles, shotguns, even a small cannon borrowed from a mining company. Enough firepower to start a small war, which was exactly what he intended. "John Wesley Hardin's here," his lieutenant reported, closing the door softly behind him. "Wants 5,000 up front, another 5 after." Snake nodded. "Pay him. Anyone else arrive?" "Clay Allison's downstairs. 3 of the younger brothers. Even that Mexican knife fighter, Cortez." "Good." Snake studied his maps of Shadow Valley. "And our little surprise? Coming in tomorrow. Army surplus, cost a fortune, but it'll be worth it." Snake smiled coldly. He'd spent every cent of his accumulated wealth hiring this force. If they failed, he was finished. But failure wasn't an option, not anymore. This had become something beyond money or territory. This was about reputation, about proving who was the most dangerous man in the territory. "We move at dawn the day after tomorrow," he decided. "I want everyone briefed tonight." Later, the town's largest saloon, filled with the deadliest collection of outlaws ever assembled in Wyoming Territory. Snake Matthews stood before them, outlining his plan with military precision. "The scout's dangerous," he acknowledged, "but he's one man, older now, slower, and we'll be coming at him from all sides with overwhelming force." John Wesley Hardin leaned against the bar, toying with his infamous revolvers. "I heard stories about this ghost," he drawled. "Heard he killed 13 men in 3 minutes up at Shadow Valley." "That true?" A murmur ran through the room. Snake's jaw tightened. "He got lucky. Caught some of my boys by surprise. Won't happen again." "Man doesn't kill 13 professional gunmen by luck," Clay Allison commented, his scarred face twisted in a perpetual sneer. "Sounds like we're hunting something special." "You're hunting what I'm paying you to hunt," Snake snapped. "A retired scout who's lived soft for 5 years and is about to learn what happens when he crosses the Laramie Gang." The room quieted. Snake returned to his maps, detailing each group's approach and objectives, but he noticed many of the hired guns exchanging glances. The legend was already growing, already affecting morale. "One last thing," he added. "I want him alive if possible. Man needs to suffer before he dies." As the meeting broke up, Hardin approached Snake privately. "These men you brought in," he muttered. "They're good with a gun, sure, but hunting a ghost? That takes something different. What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe you should have hired Indian fighters instead of gunmen." Hardin's eyes held a rare hint of concern. "Men who know how to track, how to move silent. Men who understand what we're really dealing with." Snake shoved down his own growing unease. "Just be ready to earn your money, Hardin." But as he returned to his room, Snake found himself staring at the maps, searching for weaknesses in his own plan, contingencies he might have missed, traps the ghost might be setting. "Getting spooked by stories," he muttered to himself. "He's just a man, just a fat old rancher playing at being dangerous." But in his heart, Snake knew different, had known from the moment he recognized the name of the 3rd Cavalry's legendary scout. They weren't hunting a man at all. They were hunting a ghost, and for the first time in 30 years of violence, Snake Matthews found himself afraid. Dawn found McCullough atop the ridge overlooking Crow's Creek. Through his spyglass, he watched the outlaw army stirring to life. Counting, assessing, his face betrayed nothing, but inwardly he acknowledged the challenge waiting. 50, maybe 60 guns, he murmured to himself. Professionals, most of them. He recognized some faces, men whose reputations had spread through the territories like wildfire. Hardin, Allison, others whose names were spoken in whispers. Men who lived and died by speed with a pistol. "Brought gunfighters to hunt a ghost," he said with grim satisfaction. First mistake. Returning to the ranch, he found Sarah and Billy making final preparations. The main house had been transformed into a fortress with reinforced shutters, firing ports, and stockpiled supplies. "Tomorrow," he told them, accepting the coffee Sarah offered. "Maybe the day after. They're almost ready." "How many?" Sarah asked quietly. "Too many for a fair fight." McCullough's eyes crinkled slightly. "Lucky for us. I've never believed in fighting fair." He spent the day making final adjustments to his preparations. Each approach to the ranch was now covered by overlapping fields of fire, with hidden rifle pits positioned to create deadly crossfires. Ravines and gullies that attackers might use. For cover had been subtly modified. Deadfalls rigged, flash floods prepared, rock slides ready to trigger. Not much like regular ranching, Billy observed, helping camouflage another pit trap. More similar than you'd think. McCullough arranged. Branches to hide sharpened stakes. Ranching's about understanding the land, using it to your advantage. This is just the same principle applied differently. By sunset, the scout pronounced them ready. The three shared a quiet dinner in the kitchen, the weight of what was coming hanging over them. They'll hit the outer perimeter before they realize what they're walking into, McCullough explained, using bread and salt cellars to demonstrate. Those who survive will fall back to here, where the second layer of defenses begins. By the time they understand the full layout of the traps, they'll be caught in the killing zone with no way out. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she poured. More coffee. And you're sure we can hold against so many? We're not holding. McCullough's voice was matter-of-fact. We're hunting. Later, as full darkness fell, he checked his weapons one final time. The special Henry rifle, the matched Colt revolvers, knives honed to surgical sharpness, tools of death he'd hoped never to use again. On the porch, he found Sarah waiting, her face pale in the moonlight. You don't have to do this, she said softly. We could still leave, start over somewhere else. McCullough gazed out at the ranch he'd built, the peaceful life he'd carved from wilderness. Been running for 5 years, Sarah, running from what I was, what I am. He turned to her, his eyes, reflecting starlight. Can't run anymore. This isn't just about the ranch, is it? No. He sighed, more weight settling on his broad shoulders. It's about all the others, families who can't defend themselves, people who'll suffer and die if Snake and his kind aren't stopped. Something in his voice made her step closer, studying his weathered face. This was always going to happen, wasn't it? You were always going to become the ghost again. Maybe. McCullough nodded slowly. Some men are born to certain paths. I tried to leave mine. For a while, I almost believed I could. From distant Crow's Creek came the faint sounds of raucous celebration. The outlaw army drinking, carousing, preparing for tomorrow's easy victory. They still don't understand what they're facing, Sarah observed. No, McCullough's smile held no humor. They think numbers matter, think guns and courage are enough. And they're wrong. He turned to her, the last traces of the peaceful rancher, falling away, revealing fully the legendary scout beneath. The ghost who walks. The man Apache warriors had feared above all others. They're hunting a man, he said softly, but what they'll find is a ghost, and ghosts can't be killed with bullets. In his bedroom, he spent one final hour in silent preparation, not with weapons or traps, but with the mental discipline he'd learned from an old Apache medicine man during a rare, peaceful interlude between campaigns. He cleared his mind of doubt, of fear, of hesitation, locked away the peaceful rancher he'd been pretending to be, embraced fully what lay beneath, the deadly hunter, the perfect predator. When he finally slept, his dreams were not troubled. They were calculating, cold, precise, dreams of a ghost, walking silently through killing grounds of his own making, harvesting men's lives with terrible efficiency. The storm was coming, and John McCullough was ready. The night before the planned attack, 3 outlaws stood guard at the Laramie Gang's camp outside Crow's Creek. They'd been handpicked by Snake himself, experienced men who'd survived a dozen frontier conflicts. Jumpy tonight, Edwards. One asked, noting his companion's frequent glances into the darkness. Just cautious. Edwards was a veteran of border skirmishes, his face weathered by years of hard living. Don't like hunting scouts, especially ones with the ghost's reputation. The third man spat. He ain't coming here, why would he? Got that fortress all prepared up in the valley? Edwards wasn't convinced. 20 years of outlawing had given him instincts that had kept him alive when others died, and every one of those instincts was screaming now. I'm checking the horses, he muttered, moving away from the firelight. The remuda was picketed in a small clearing 50 yards from the main camp. Edwards moved among the animals, checking picket lines, soothing nervous mounts. Everything seemed normal. Then he noticed it, a single horse missing, Snake's prized black stallion. "Hey, Jackson," he called softly. "Snake move his horse?" No answer. "Jackson." Edwards drew his revolver, moving cautiously back toward the fire pit. Both men were still there, seemingly unchanged. But as he drew closer, his blood ran cold. They sat just as he'd left them. But their throats had been cut with surgical precision, their life's blood soaking silently into the thirsty ground, and carved into the dirt between them a single word: ghost. Edwards opened his mouth to scream the alarm. Never made a sound. A hand clamped over his mouth from behind, and cold steel sliced across his throat. He felt a brief searing pain. Then, nothing at all. In the main camp, 60 hardened killers slept on, unaware that death had walked among them and departed with its message delivered. Dawn brought chaos. Snake Matthews stood in the center of his camp, face purple with rage, as he stared at the 3 bodies his men had discovered. More disturbing than the deaths was what had been taken: his prize stallion, his personal rifle, and most alarmingly, the maps detailing their attack plans. "He was here," Snake whispered, fear mingling with fury. "Walked right through 60 armed men, killed 3, took what he wanted, left his calling card." John Wesley Hardin studied the bodies with professional interest. Clean work. Didn't make a sound. Didn't wake a soul. For the first time in years, respect colored the infamous gunman's voice. "Man's got talents that go beyond fast shooting." "Change of plans," Snake announced to his assembled force. "We move today. Now, before he can use what he learned against us." But morale had shifted overnight. The hired guns muttered among themselves, suddenly less certain about this hunt. 3 veteran outlaws killed silently in the midst of a well-guarded camp. It spoke of skills beyond ordinary men. "He's playing with us," Clay Allison growled, "sending a message." "Message received," Snake snapped. "And I'm sending one back. I want 20 men to ride ahead, burn out every small ranch and farm between here and Shadow Valley. Show him what happens when he plays games with the Laramie Gang." The orders sent a ripple of discomfort through even these hardened men, burning homesteads, killing innocents. This went beyond ordinary banditry. "You said this was about taking down one man," Hardin objected. "Didn't sign on to murder families." "You signed on to follow orders," Snake snarled. "Or you can forfeit your payment and ride out." Hardin's hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped. Money was money after all. "Your hunt, your rules," he conceded, but his eyes had grown colder. As the force prepared to move out, a young lookout came running into camp. "Riders coming," he gasped. "From the south." Snake grabbed his spyglass, focusing on the distant dust cloud. His remaining color drained away. "Cavalry," he whispered. "Full company strength." Panic rippled through the camp. Many of these men were wanted by the army for crimes during and after the war. The sight of approaching blue uniforms triggered immediate fear. "How?" Snake demanded. "Of empty air." How did they know? The answer came from an unexpected source. One of his men approached, carrying something found on the trail, a single piece of paper weighed down with a stone. Snake unfolded it with trembling fingers. Inside was his own handwriting, the attack plans stolen in the night. But now they bore an addition, a military officer's signature and scrawled note. "Plan to attack peaceful ranchers with unlawful force. Cavalry dispatched. Cole J. Porter, 6th Cavalry." "Impossible," Snake breathed. "Fort Richardson's 4 days' hard ride from here." "Ghost moves fast," Hardin observed dryly. "Apparently has friends in high places too." The approaching cavalry proved to be something worse. U.S. Marshals with proper jurisdiction, accompanied by territorial militia. Snake had no choice but to order his force to scatter into the hills, abandoning their planned direct assault. "This isn't over," he growled to his core gang members as they fled. "We'll circle around, come at the valley from the west, take him before the law can interfere." But the damage was done. More than half his hired guns melted away, unwilling to face federal marshals or the ghost who could summon them at will. Even those who remained looked at Snake with new eyes, questioning his leadership, his strategy, his understanding of what they truly faced. Back at Shadow Valley, McCullough sat calmly at his kitchen table, drinking coffee with Billy and Sarah. "They won't come today," he announced, setting down his cup. "Not in force, anyway." "How can you be sure?" Sarah asked. "Because I spent the night delivering a message." His eyes crinkled slightly. "And arranging a distraction." "You weren't in your room," Billy gaped. "Where did you go?" "Paid a visit to Snake's camp. Borrowed some things he'll miss. Left some tracks leading south." Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. "The cavalry? But there's no fort within days of here." "No," McCullough agreed, but Snake doesn't know that. By the time he realizes those cavalry are just Marshal Harker and some deputies with borrowed uniforms, he'll have lost half his force. The boy stared with undisguised admiration. "Like fighting Apache, getting in the enemy's mind." "Exactly." McCullough nodded approvingly. "Most men think fighting is about strength, numbers, firepower. It's not. It's about making your enemy defeat himself." "So we're safe?" Sarah asked hopefully. "For today." McCullough rose, checking his weapons with habitual care. "But Snake's smart. He'll regroup, try a different approach, probably smaller teams, coming from multiple directions." "And that's bad?" "That's perfect." The ghost's cold smile appeared. "Smaller groups are easier to hunt." He spent the afternoon moving through the valley like a shadow, checking traps, adjusting firing angles, reading sign. Snake's stallion, now hidden in a box canyon, had provided valuable intelligence. Saddlebags containing names of all hired guns, their payment records, and most critically, their fallback plans. When Billy found him checking rifle sights on the northern ridge, the boy asked the question that had been bothering him since morning. "Those men at the camp," he said hesitantly, "the ones who died. Did you have to kill them?" McCullough paused, regarding the youth thoughtfully. "War has its own rules, son, different from peaceful times. But they were just guards, right? Not the ones who hurt people. Every man riding with Snake made his choice." McCullough's voice was gentle but firm. "Every one of them came to kill us, burn this valley, terrorize innocent folks." Billy nodded, slowly, still troubled. "It's just doing it while they slept. Seems unfair," McCullough finished. "That's white man's thinking. Comes from too many stories about noble gunfights at high noon." His weathered face turned serious. "The Apache taught me differently. In real war, you use every advantage. Strike when your enemy is weakest. Make him fear the dark, fear the silence, fear his own shadow." He gestured toward the distant hills where Snake's remaining forces would be regrouping. Right now, 60 men are looking over their shoulders, jumping at sounds, doubting their leaders. That's worth more than 20 men killed in a fair fight. By nightfall, McCullough had prepared the next phase of his psychological campaign. Small, carefully positioned mirrors to catch moonlight and create ghostly movements, thin wires strung, with rattlesnake rattles that would sound in the wind. Apache tricks designed to fray nerves and break concentration. "They'll come tomorrow night," he told Sarah as they checked supplies. "Snake will have worked out my cavalry bluff by then. He'll be desperate, angry, needing to restore his reputation." "We should be scared," Sarah observed, studying his calm face. "Facing these odds, yet you seem almost happy." McCullough considered the word. "Not happy, but myself. For 5 years I've been playing a role, being something I'm not. And now the ghost walks again." He checked his revolvers one final time. And tomorrow night, the Laramie Gang learns why that name used to make Apache warriors tremble in their sleep. Deputy James Cooper crouched in the underbrush, watching the remnants of Snake Matthews' force regroup in a hidden valley 6 miles west of Crow's Creek. 27 men remained of the original 60, their expressions dark with anger and fear. As Snake berated them, at 24, Cooper was the youngest deputy marshal in Wyoming Territory. He was also the most determined, having lost his father to border raiders during the war. When Marshal Harker's deception using borrowed cavalry uniforms had scattered the Laramie Gang, Cooper had volunteered to track the remaining outlaws. What he hadn't told the marshal was his real interest, not in Snake Matthews, but in John McCullough. Stories of the ghost who walks had fascinated Cooper since childhood. His father, a former Army scout himself, had told him tales of the legendary tracker who could outthink, outfight, and outshoot any man alive. Now that Ghost was awake again, and Cooper intended to witness what happened next. Won't be fooled again. Snake was shouting, his face contorted with rage. McCullough played us, but he's just one man, one aging fat rancher playing at being a ghost. He killed 3 of our best without waking a single sentry, someone objected. Took your horse. Your plans, right from under our noses. And he'll pay for that, Snake snarled. New plan. We split into 3 groups, 9 men each. Hit the valley from different directions after midnight. No firing until you're inside his perimeter. Silent approach. Cooper noted the details, impressed despite himself. Snake might be a murderous outlaw, but he had sound tactical instincts. A 3-pronged night assault against a single defender, even one as legendary as McCullough, should overwhelm any defense. Carefully, the deputy backed away. He needed to reach Shadow Valley before these men launched their attack. Not to warn McCullough, the old scout could handle himself, but to see the ghost in action, to learn from him. His horse was tethered a mile away. Cooper reached it without incident and set off at a ground-eating lope toward Shadow Valley. The terrain was challenging, but he'd grown up in these mountains, knew every trail and shortcut. It was mid-afternoon when he crested the final ridge overlooking McCullough's ranch. He'd expected to find a fortress under frantic preparation. Instead, he saw what appeared to be routine ranch work. McCullough split firewood near the barn. A woman, the Jensen widow Cooper recognized, hung laundry. A young man repaired a wagon wheel. If he hadn't known better, Cooper would never have suspected these people were hours away from a life-or-death siege. He urged his horse down the slope, approaching openly. No point trying to sneak up on a man with McCullough's reputation. Sure enough, the rancher paused in his work, tracking Cooper's approach with eyes that missed nothing. By the time the deputy reached the yard, McCullough had positioned himself with clear lines of fire to every approach, the axe in his hands held casually, but ready. "Deputy Cooper," the rancher acknowledged, his voice neutral. "What brings you to Shadow Valley?" Cooper dismounted, keeping his hands clear of his weapons. "You know who I am? James Cooper, 24, deputy for 8 months. Mother's people were Crow. Father scouted for the 7th Cavalry before the war." McCullough set down his axe. "I make it my business to know everyone within 50 miles. Cooper felt a chill. He'd never spoken more than a few words to McCullough during his rare visits to town, yet the man had assembled a complete dossier on him. "Marshal send you?" McCullough asked. "No, sir. He doesn't know I'm here." Cooper took a breath, deciding honesty was his only viable approach. "Snake Matthews is bringing 27 men to hit your ranch tonight, 3 groups of 9 from different directions, after midnight." If McCullough was surprised by this intelligence, he showed no sign. "Coffee's hot. You look like you rode hard getting here." Inside the kitchen, Cooper accepted a steaming cup from Sarah Jensen, noting how she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been drilled in emergency protocols. The young man, Billy, joined them, his eyes studying Cooper with open suspicion. "How'd you come by this information, Deputy?" McCullough asked, settling his bulk into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Tracked them after the marshal's ruse scattered them. Listened to their planning." Cooper sipped the strong coffee. "Snake's desperate, losing face with his men. Needs a victory to maintain control." McCullough nodded. "And you rode all this? Way to warn us? Mighty civic-minded." Cooper met the older man's gaze directly. "My father was Robert Cooper, scouted with the 4th Cavalry during the Navajo campaigns." Understanding flickered in McCullough's eyes. "Bob Cooper, good man. Steady. Tracker. Died during the war, I heard. Raiders took our farm in '63, killed him when he tried to stop them." Cooper set down his cup. "Before he died, he told me stories about a scout they called the Ghost. Said if I ever needed to learn the true meaning of justice, that was the man to study." Silence filled the kitchen. Sarah and Billy exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with this direct reference to McCullough's past. "Your father was exaggerating," McCullough said finally. "I was just a scout doing a job. With respect, sir, we both know that's not true." Cooper leaned forward. "I didn't come just to warn you. I came to see, to learn." "Learn what exactly?" "How one man stands against 30, how the Ghost fights." McCullough studied him for a long moment. "You wearing that badge because you believe in the law, Deputy Cooper, or because it gives you authority to hunt men?" The question struck home. Cooper flushed. "I believe in justice. Justice and law aren't always the same thing." McCullough rose, moving to the window with a grace that belied his size. "What happens here tonight won't be legal, won't be something a deputy marshal should witness, much less participate in. I understand that. Do you?" McCullough turned, and suddenly the facade of the peaceful rancher fell away completely. Cooper found himself staring into the eyes of the Ghost, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of mercy. "Because men are going to die tonight, Deputy, not in fair fights, not with legal warnings or chances to surrender. They're going to die in darkness, in silence, never knowing what hit them." Cooper swallowed hard. "Like those 3 in Snake's camp last night?" "That was just a message. Tonight is the real hunt." Billy spoke up unexpectedly. "Mr. McCullough, he could help. Another gun, another set of eyes." "It's not about guns, son." McCullough never took his gaze from Cooper. "It's about whether the deputy here understands what he's really asking to be part of. This isn't a story, isn't some grand adventure. It's blood and death and choices that stay with you for the rest of your life." Cooper stood, meeting the older man's stare. "I've made my choice, same as you did, when my father's killers came to your ranch 5 years ago." Shock flashed across McCullough's face, the first genuine emotion Cooper had seen from him. "That's right," the deputy continued quietly. "I recognized you when you first came to Wyoming. Couldn't believe it at first. The legendary Ghost, pretending to be a simple rancher, but I checked the records, the timing, the description." McCullough's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "What do you think you know, boy? I know 4 men raided your homestead in Arizona Territory 5 years ago. I know none of them were ever seen again. And I know those same 4 men had burned my family's farm in '63. Silence stretched between them. "My father's dying words were about you," Cooper said. "He made me promise to find the Ghost someday, to thank him." His voice thickened. "I've carried that promise for 10 years. McCullough returned to his chair, suddenly looking older. "I remember your father's farm, remember what those raiders did." He sighed heavily. "When they showed up in Arizona 5 years later, I recognized them, did what needed doing. And then you left, came here, tried to forget what you were. Tried to be something different," McCullough corrected. "Something better than a killer." Cooper nodded toward the window where the sun was beginning its westward descent. "But now the Ghost walks again. Had no choice. The Laramie Gang leaves no survivors, burns everything they touch. Someone had to stop them. Then let me help. Cooper's hand moved to his badge. I'll take this off if I have to. McCullough studied him with new eyes, measuring, assessing. Keep your badge, deputy. You might need its authority before this is over. He gestured to Billy. Show him the defenses. Explain the plan for tonight. After the younger men left, Sarah approached the table. Can you trust him? Bob Cooper's son. McCullough poured more coffee. If he's half the man his father was, he's one of the few I'd trust with my life. He knows who you really are, what happens when this is over. McCullough gazed into his cup, seeing reflections of the past, glimpses of possible futures. Don't know. Maybe it's time the ghost stopped hiding. Maybe Wyoming Territory needs to know what walks in its shadows. Outside, Cooper followed Billy. Through the carefully prepared defenses, his professional eyes noting the tactical brilliance of each trap, each firing position, each escape route. This went beyond military training, beyond even the legendary skills of frontier scouts. This was something else entirely. This was the ghost's work. And tonight, James Cooper would witness firsthand why that name had once made the Southwest's deadliest warriors tremble in fear. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Martha Carson stood on her porch with a loaded shotgun across her arms. At 62, her once auburn hair had gone silver, and her hands bore the calluses of decades of frontier living. But her spine remained straight, her blue eyes clear and determined. 40 years she'd lived on this land. 40 years of drought, blizzards, Indian raids, and outlaws. She'd buried her husband 10 years ago, her only son during the war. But she'd endured, carving a modest ranch from unyielding wilderness through sheer force of will. Now 5 riders approached her homestead, and Martha recognized trouble when she saw it. That's far enough, she called when they reached the edge of her yard. State your business. The lead rider, a lean man with a face like tanned leather, reined in. Looking for John McCullough. Heard he might be around these parts. Martha's expression revealed nothing, though her grip on the shotgun tightened. John had ridden through 2 days earlier, warning her about the Laramie Gang, offering her shelter at his ranch. She'd declined. The Carsons didn't run, not from weather, not from Indians, and certainly not from outlaws. Haven't seen him, she replied evenly. Now kindly move on. Daylight's wasting and I've chores to finish. The leader studied her, eyes cold. Ma'am, I'm afraid we need to look around. Make sure you're telling us the truth. This is private property, mister. You have no rights. The man laughed, a sound without humor. Lady, do you know who we are? We're the Laramie Gang. We take what we want, go where we please. Martha raised the shotgun. Not on my land, you don't. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then the leader nodded to one of his men, who dismounted and started toward the barn. Martha fired. The blast caught the man in the chest, throwing him backward into the dust. Jesus! The leader drew his revolver. You crazy old woman! Martha had already broken open the shotgun, reloading with practiced speed. Next one who moves gets the same. Now get off my property and take your trash with you. The leader's face contorted with rage. Nobody does that to the Laramie Gang. Nobody. He raised his gun. Burn it all. What followed was a nightmare of fire and violence. Martha fought with desperate courage, wounding 2 more before they overwhelmed her. They dragged her from the house, forced her to watch as they set fire to everything she'd spent a lifetime building. Where's McCullough? The leader demanded, pressing his gun to her temple. Tell me, or I swear to God, you'll die slower than you can imagine. Martha Carson, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, spat in his face. Go to hell! Miles away, smoke rising from the direction of the Carson homestead caught Cooper's attention as he rode patrol around Shadow Valley's perimeter. He alerted McCullough, who studied the distant smudge with a spyglass. Martha Carson's place, the scout confirmed, his voice dangerously quiet. Snakes trying to draw me out. Cooper checked his weapons. We've got to help her. Can't. Not without abandoning our defenses, leaving Sarah and Billy vulnerable. McCullough's face was impassive, but his eyes burned with cold fury. Snake knows that. It's a diversion, trying to split our forces. So we just let her die? Cooper couldn't keep the outrage from his voice. Nobody said that. McCullough handed him the spyglass. Look again. Count the riders. Cooper focused on the distant scene. 5. Small group. Exactly. Snake keeps his main force hidden, sends a small team to create a distraction. McCullough was already moving, checking his weapons. You stay here. Maintain our defense. I'll handle Martha's situation. Alone? Against 5 men? The ghost's cold smile appeared. 5 men against 1 ghost? Poor odds for them. Cooper watched in astonishment as McCullough's entire demeanor changed. The heavy, awkward movements vanished. Even his physical appearance seemed to alter. Not that he became thinner, but somehow his bulk rearranged itself, becoming something predatory and dangerous. If I'm not back by nightfall, McCullough instructed, you follow the original plan. Use the traps, create confusion, buy time until I return. And if you don't return... McCullough paused, then reached into his pocket and handed Cooper a folded paper. Then open this. It contains everything you need to know about finishing what I started. He was gone within minutes, moving with a speed and silence that belied his size. Cooper stared after him, the folded paper heavy in his hand. Sarah appeared at his side. He'll be back, she said, though uncertainty tinged her voice. He has to be. At the Carson homestead, Martha sat bound to a chair dragged from her burning house. Her captors had spent the past hour questioning her about McCullough's defenses, growing increasingly frustrated with her stubborn silence. Last chance, old woman, the leader growled, pressing the hot barrel of his revolver against her cheek. Tell us about Shadow Valley's defenses, and we'll make it quick. Martha stared back at him with undimmed defiance. I'm 62 years. Old mister, lived through Comanche raids, survived winters that would freeze the soul out of you. You think you scare me? She laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. You're nothing but a strutting boy playing at being dangerous. The leader drew back his hand to strike her, then froze. Something had changed. Some subtle shift in the atmosphere that his instincts recognized before his conscious mind. Check the perimeter, he ordered his remaining men, suddenly nervous. Something's not right. Boss, there's nobody out there, one complained. We've been watching all... He never finished the sentence. A shot from nowhere took him through the throat, so precise he was dead before he hit the ground. The others scattered, diving for cover, guns drawn. But they were shooting at shadows, firing at sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A second man fell, clutching at the knife suddenly protruding from his chest. A third screamed as a bullet shattered his kneecap, leaving him writhing in the dust. Where are you? The leader shouted, spinning wildly, shooting at phantoms. Show yourself, you coward! Here. The voice came from directly behind him. The outlaw whirled, firing blindly, but hit nothing. Another shot rang out, and his gun hand exploded in pain, his revolver flying into the dust. John McCullough seemed to materialize from thin air, standing before the outlaw with cold eyes and a cocked revolver. Remember me? The ghost asked softly. The fat rancher from Shadow Valley. The leader's face drained of color. We were just following orders. Snake said... I don't care what Snake said. McCullough's voice was terrifyingly calm. You hurt an innocent woman, burned her home. That makes this personal. Please. The outlaw's bravado had vanished, replaced by naked fear. I can tell you Snake's plans, where he'll be tonight. Everything. I already know his plans. McCullough glanced at the burning homestead, then back to the trembling outlaw. What I want to know is whether you're ready to meet your maker. 10 minutes later, McCullough cut Martha free. She was bruised and bloodied but unbroken, her spirit as indomitable as ever. Knew you'd come, she said, as he helped her to a horse, one of the outlaw's mounts. Told them you would. Told them what would happen. I'm sorry about your home. Martha, she gazed at the smoldering ruins, grief finally showing through her tough exterior. House can be rebuilt, land endures. Her eyes moved to where 4 bodies lay in the dust. What about him? She nodded toward the leader, trussed up like a holiday turkey. He's going to deliver a message for me, a very specific message. McCullough's voice held no mercy. Then he's going to decide whether he wants to face a hanging or ride as far from Wyoming Territory as a horse can take him. By sunset, McCullough returned to Shadow Valley with Martha Carson riding beside him. Cooper met them at the perimeter. Relief evident on his young face. Was starting to worry, he admitted. Any trouble? Nothing I couldn't handle. McCullough helped Martha from her horse. Mrs. Carson will be staying with us through what's coming. She's earned a front-row seat to the Laramie Gang's last stand. Later, as Martha rested in one of the upstairs bedrooms, Cooper approached McCullough privately. One of them survived, he guessed. You let him go. With a message. McCullough was checking his weapons, preparing for the night ahead. Wanted Snake to understand exactly what's waiting for him. What message? The ghost looked up, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. That he's not hunting me anymore. I'm hunting him. That everything that happens from this point forward isn't about business or territory or reputation. His voice dropped to a whisper. It's about justice. For Martha, for Sarah's husband, for every innocent person the Laramie Gang has hurt. Cooper felt a chill at the implacable certainty in those words. This wasn't bravado or frontier posturing. This was a death sentence, delivered by a man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of dealing death. They're still coming, he said. 27 hardened killers against 4 of us. Numbers don't matter, McCullough replied, repeating what was becoming a mantra. Not against a ghost. As darkness fell, the 4 defenders of Shadow Valley made their final preparations. Martha Carson, despite her injuries, insisted on taking a position at an upstairs window with a loaded rifle. Those bastards burned my home, she said, when Sarah tried to convince her to rest. I aim to return the favor. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the surrounding hills, Snake Matthews and his killers were preparing their midnight assault, confident in their numbers and firepower. None of them understood what truly awaited them in Shadow Valley. None of them comprehended the deadly efficiency of the ghost's carefully laid traps or the cold precision of his plans within plans. By dawn, the Laramie Gang would be no more, and the legend of the ghost who walks would be reborn in blood and fire. 2 hours before midnight, Shadow Valley fell into an eerie silence. Even the night birds and insects seemed to sense the coming violence, their usual chorus muted to faint whispers. Inside the main house, McCullough gathered his defenders for final instructions. They'll come in 3 groups, he explained, pointing to the detailed map spread across the dining table. 9 men each, approaching from different directions. They'll try to stay silent until they're inside our outer perimeter. Cooper studied the map, noting the carefully marked defensive positions, the interlocking fields of fire, the escape routes. This isn't something you put together in a few days, he observed. You've been planning this since you arrived, haven't you? McCullough nodded. 5 years of preparation, just in case. In case of what? Martha Carson asked, her wounded face bandaged but her eyes sharp as ever. In case the past caught up with me, McCullough's voice was matter-of-fact. In case I had to become the ghost again. He rose, moving to a large cabinet that dominated one wall of the dining room. To casual observers, it appeared to be simple storage for china and linens. But when McCullough pressed a hidden catch, the entire front panel swung open, revealing a secret compartment filled with weapons. Billy gasped. Sarah's eyes widened. Even Cooper, who thought he'd understood what they were facing, found himself speechless. The hidden arsenal contained dozens of firearms, from standard army revolvers to specialized weapons none of them had seen before. Custom rifles with brass telescopic sights, shotguns modified for specific tactical purposes, even exotic foreign weapons, Turkish flintlocks, Japanese throwing stars, Apache war clubs. Been collecting these for 20 years, McCullough explained, removing specific weapons and placing them on the table. Each has its purpose, each its place in tonight's work. Cooper picked up a strange-looking revolver with an unusually long barrel and customized grip. Never seen anything like this. Custom-made by a German gunsmith in Tucson, balanced for my hand specifically. Sights adjusted to my eye. McCullough took it, checking the action with practiced ease. Can hit a man's heart at 100 yards. Killed 17 Apache warriors with that gun during the Jefferson Canyon campaign. He moved methodically through the arsenal, selecting weapons for each defender based on their skills and positions. For Billy, a reliable Winchester repeating rifle and a Colt Army revolver. For Sarah, a light carbine she could handle easily from her upstairs position. For Martha, a shotgun that required less precise aim, perfect for her injured state. Cooper received a matched pair of revolvers with consecutive serial numbers. These were my first custom pieces, McCullough told him. Carried them through the early Apache campaigns before I developed more specialized tools. Last came the Ghost's personal weapons, the specialized revolvers seen earlier, the modified Henry rifle, and a collection of knives that ranged from delicate surgical blades to massive Bowie knives capable of cleaving bone. You're really expecting full-scale war, Sarah said softly, watching him arm himself with methodical precision. Not war, McCullough corrected. Hunting. From a hidden compartment in the floor, he next produced boxes of ammunition. Not standard. Rounds, but custom-loaded cartridges prepared for specific purposes. Some designed for maximum stopping power, others for quiet operation, still others containing multiple projectiles for close-quarter fighting. Each round is marked, he explained, distributing the ammunition. Brass tip for standard, red for the special loads. Don't mix them up. As the others checked their weapons, McCullough pulled Cooper aside, leading him to a small study off the main room. From a wall safe concealed behind a painting, he removed a leather-bound book. This is my record, he said, handing it to the young deputy. 15 years of scouting. Every technique, every lesson, every trick I learned tracking the Apache. His voice grew somber. If I don't survive tonight, it's yours. Cooper hefted the book, understanding the value of what he held. Why me? Because you remind me of your father. He understood what I was trying to do. Understood that sometimes justice can't wait for courts and trials. McCullough's weathered face showed rare emotion. And because someone needs to remember the Ghost's methods after I'm gone. You're not planning to die tonight. Never plan to die, McCullough agreed, but always prepare for the possibility. They returned to find the others ready, weapons checked and loaded, faces set with grim determination. McCullough led them through. On final review of their positions and responsibilities. Remember, he emphasized, stay in your assigned locations unless I signal otherwise. Don't fire until I give the word. After that, aim true and shoot to kill. These men aren't coming to arrest us or rob us. They're coming to wipe us from the earth. He looked at each of them in turn, gauging their resolve, offering silent support. Questions? Billy cleared his throat nervously. What if there are too many? What if we can't hold them? We'll hold them, McCullough assured him. But if something goes wrong, there's the escape tunnel beneath the root cellar. Opens half a mile east in the Box Canyon. Horses are stashed there, supplies too. This was news to Cooper. You built a tunnel? Built lots of things these past 5 years. McCullough's smile was grim. Suppose I never really believed I could escape what I am. Who I am. As they moved to their positions, Sarah lingered, touching McCullough's arm. John, she said, using his first name for the first time, promise me something, if I can. Promise you'll come back, after tonight, after the ghost finishes his work. Her eyes held his. Promise the man will return. McCullough's face softened momentarily. I'll try, Sarah. That's all I can offer. Alone in the kitchen, McCullough performed one final ritual. From a small pouch, he removed 7 Apache arrowheads, the same ones he'd examined days earlier. Each represented a time he should have died, but survived, each a reminder of his own mortality. He arranged them in a circle on the table, then added an 8th, one he'd carried for 5 years without marking, the arrow that had nearly killed him in that last Arizona campaign, the one that had convinced him to retire. Full circle, he murmured, studying the arrangement. Then he swept them back into the pouch, tied it to his belt, and moved to the porch to await what was coming. Outside, Shadow Valley lay bathed in silver moonlight. To untrained eyes, the ranch appeared peaceful, vulnerable. None would notice the subtle irregularities in the landscape, firing pits disguised as casual depressions, tripwires hidden among natural growth, deadfalls prepared to drop at the pull of a hidden cord. 1 hour, Cooper said softly, joining him on the porch. Will they come? They'll come. McCullough scanned the surrounding terrain with the practiced eye of a scout who had spent decades reading landscapes. Snake's got too much pride to back. Down now. Too much reputation at stake. Cooper nodded toward the positions where Sarah, Billy, and Martha waited. They're civilians, not soldiers, not killers. Tonight, everyone becomes what they need to be to survive. McCullough checked his weapons one final time, but if it helps, they won't need to do much killing. That's my responsibility. Our responsibility, Cooper corrected. I didn't come here just to watch. McCullough studied the young deputy, seeing echoes of Bob Cooper in his determined stance. Your father would be proud of the man you've become. Not many would risk their badge, their future for something like this. Some things matter more than badges. Cooper's hand drifted to the book he now carried in his vest. Some knowledge needs to be preserved, and some men need killing, McCullough finished softly, even when the law says otherwise. They lapsed into silence, each lost in his own thoughts as the minutes ticked away. Somewhere in the surrounding night, death was approaching. 27 professional killers moving silently toward what they believed would be an easy victory. Inside the house, Billy checked his weapons again, trying to control his trembling hands. Sarah whispered quiet prayers from her upstairs window. Martha Carson clutched her shotgun, thoughts of her burned home hardening her resolve. At precisely 11:30, McCullough stiffened almost imperceptibly. His head turned slightly like a predator catching a scent. They're moving, he whispered. Cooper strained to hear, seeing nothing in the silvered landscape. How can you tell? Owl stopped calling. Crickets went silent to the west. McCullough's voice was barely audible. They're coming earlier than planned, trying to catch us unprepared. Without another word, he melted into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness so completely that even Cooper, standing 10 feet away, couldn't track his movement. The ghost was going hunting. Cooper took his position by the front window, rifle ready, senses straining for any sign of the approaching outlaws. But the night remained silent, the valley apparently empty. Minutes passed, a half hour, nothing. Then, just when Cooper began to wonder if McCullough had been mistaken, he heard it. Not gunfire or shouts, but something more disturbing, a strangled gasp quickly cut off. Then another, sounds at the very edge of hearing, coming from different directions around the ranch's perimeter. The ghost was at work. Peering into the darkness, Cooper finally saw movement. Shadows flowing toward the house from 3 directions, but their formation had broken down, their coordinated approach shattered. Men moved singly or in pairs, crouching low, clearly unnerved by the disappearance of their comrades. From somewhere in the darkness came a low whistle, McCullough's signal. Cooper raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at the nearest approaching shadow. The siege of Shadow Valley was about to begin, in earnest, and the legend of the ghost who walks was about to be written in blood. The first shots shattered the night's silence. Cooper fired with deadly precision, dropping an outlaw who'd ventured too close to the house. From upstairs, Sarah and Martha added their fire, forcing the attackers to scatter for cover. But something was wrong. The assault lacked coordination, purpose. Men moved aimlessly, shooting without clear targets. Their earlier discipline evaporated. "They're in disarray," Cooper muttered, reloading his rifle. "What happened to their leadership?" His answer came minutes later when McCullough materialized beside him, moving so silently that Cooper nearly shot him in surprise. "Snake's not with them," the scout reported, his voice a harsh whisper. "Neither are his lieutenants. These are just the hired guns, sent in as fodder." "Where's Snake?" "Don't know, but this isn't his main attack. Something's changed." McCullough's eyes swept the battlefield, registering details invisible to others. 5 dead on the perimeter, 3 more in the western approach. "The rest are pinned down or scattered," Cooper processed this information. "So we've won?" "No." McCullough's face was grim. "Snake's too smart for this. He's planning something else, something we're not seeing." As if summoned by his words, a new sound cut. Through the sporadic gunfire, the rhythmic drumming of approaching hoofbeats. Many horses moving fast, coming from the east, the one direction they hadn't expected attack. McCullough moved to the window, studying the new threat through his spyglass. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Cavalry," he whispered. "The army?" Cooper asked in confusion. "But they can't be involved in—" "Not current army," McCullough corrected, passing him the spyglass. "Look at their uniforms, Confederate gray mixed with civilian clothes. Former rebel cavalry, riding like they're still fighting the war." Cooper looked, then swore softly. "At least 30 riders, well armed, military formation." He turned to McCullough. "This wasn't in Snake's arsenal before." "No, this is something new." The scout's mind raced, recalculating odds, revising strategies. "Sarah, Billy, Martha, maintain fire on the scattered forces. Keep them pinned down. Cooper, with me." They moved to the eastern side of the house, watching as the cavalry force deployed with professional precision. Unlike the chaotic attack of the hired guns, these men moved with the coordination that comes from years of fighting together. "Border raiders," McCullough identified them. "Quantrill's men, maybe. Or Anderson's. Kept riding after the war. Turned. Outlaw. Snake must have promised them a fortune to bring them in." At the cavalry unit's center rode a commanding figure on a magnificent black stallion. Even at this distance, his military bearing was unmistakable. "That's not Snake," Cooper observed. "No!" McCullough's voice hardened. "That's Colonel William Hammond, former Confederate cavalry commander, butcher of Lawrence, thought he was dead or in Mexico." As they watched, the cavalry unit formed up in attack formation. A rider detached from their line, approaching the house under a white flag of truce. "McCullough," the rider shouted when he was within earshot. "Colonel Hammond requests a parley, unarmed, under flag of truce." Cooper glanced at McCullough. "Could be a trap." "Definitely a trap," the scout agreed, "but I need to know what game they're playing." He checked his hidden weapons. "Cover me from here. If it goes bad, aim for Hammond first." Before Cooper could object, McCullough was moving onto the porch. His Henry rifle held loosely in one hand, the other clearly visible and empty. "I accept your parley," he called back. "Halfway point, just Hammond and me." Minutes later, McCullough stood in the moonlight, facing Colonel William Hammond, across 20 feet of open ground. The Confederate officer looked older than his 50 years, his once black beard now streaked with gray, his face weathered by hardship and violence. But his eyes remained the same, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of mercy. "John McCullough," Hammond said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of his Virginia upbringing. "The famous ghost who walks. Been a long time." "Not long enough, Colonel." McCullough kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but his stance made clear how quickly that could change. "Last I heard, you were hiding in Mexico after that business." "In Kansas," Hammond smiled thinly. "Circumstances change. Found new opportunities north of the border." He gestured toward the valley. "Nice place you've carved out here. Shame you won't live to enjoy it much longer." "You're working with Snake Matthews now? Bit beneath your usual standards?" "Temporary arrangement. Mutual interests." Hammond's smile faded. "He wants this valley. I want you. Specifically, I want you dead. Ghost." McCullough's face revealed nothing. "What's your grievance with me, Colonel? Don't recall our paths crossing during the war." "Little Springs, Arizona Territory, 1867. Hammond's voice turned brittle with hatred. "You led that scout mission, tracked my brother and his men for 6 days through Apache territory, cut them down without warning, without mercy." Understanding dawned. "Your brother was Richard Hammond. Led that band of deserters who were raiding homesteads, killing families. He was a soldier adapting to changing times." Hammond's composure cracked momentarily. "You hunted him like an animal." "He was an animal." McCullough's voice was flat. "Saw what was left of the Patterson family after your brother's men finished with them. Still see their faces in my dreams sometimes." Hammond regained his control with visible effort. "Ancient history now. Just wanted you to know why, before the end. Wanted you to understand this isn't just business." "It never is." McCullough's eyes never left the Colonel's face. "So what's the offer? Must be some reason for this parley." "Simple. With terms. Surrender now, walk out with your people. I give you my word as an officer they won't be harmed. Just you and me, settling old business." "And if I refuse," Hammond gestured toward his waiting cavalry, "then I burn that house to the ground, with everyone inside. 30 experienced raiders against your handful of defenders. No contest, Ghost." McCullough appeared to consider this, his face thoughtful. "One question first. Where's Snake? Why isn't he here for his big moment?" Something flickered across Hammond's face, a momentary hesitation that confirmed McCullough's suspicions. "Snake's handling other aspects of the operation," the Colonel replied, a fraction too quickly. "He doesn't know you're here, does he?" McCullough pressed. "This is your personal vendetta, not part of his plan." Hammond's jaw tightened. "Our arrangement is complicated." "No, it's simple. You used him, used his resources, his intelligence about the valley, his hatred of me. But this isn't his operation anymore. It's yours. Does it matter? The outcome remains the same." Hammond straightened, his patience clearly waning. "Your answer, Ghost, surrender or burn." McCullough studied the Colonel, weighing options, calculating possibilities. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll need 5 minutes to explain to my people. Ensure they don't resist." Hammond smiled coldly. 3 minutes, then I expect to see you walking out that door unarmed." McCullough turned, walking back toward the house with measured steps. Inside, Cooper waited, his face tense with concern. "You're not really surrendering?" he demanded as soon as McCullough entered. "Of course not." The scout moved quickly, checking his weapons. "But Hammond's arrival changes everything. The cavalry unit is the real threat now, not Snake's scattered guns." He glanced toward the windows, where Sarah, Billy, and Martha maintained their positions. "Hammond's men are professionals. Military training, combat experience. Our defenses won't hold against a coordinated cavalry charge." "So, what's the plan?" McCullough's eyes glinted in the darkness. "We change the rules. Stop defending, start hunting." He quickly outlined his strategy, sending Billy to prepare specific equipment from the hidden arsenal. Sarah and Martha were repositioned, given new instructions that made their eyes widen in surprise. That's insane, Cooper protested when he heard the full plan. You can't possibly. It's our only chance. McCullough cut him off. Hammond expects me to surrender. He's not prepared for what's coming. He checked his watch. 1 minute. Everyone ready? They nodded, faces pale but determined. McCullough moved to the door, then paused, turning back to face them one last time. Whatever happens next, remember what I taught you. Move like ghosts, strike without warning, and never, ever fight fair. Outside, Hammond watched the house with growing impatience. His cavalry unit remained mounted, ready to charge at his command. The scattered remnants of Snake's hired guns had fallen silent, waiting to see what developed. When the front door finally opened, Hammond allowed himself a cold smile of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. 5 years of searching, of planning revenge for his brother's death, was about to reach its culmination. But the smile froze on his face as he saw not McCullough emerging in surrender, but a cloud of dense white smoke billowing from every window and door of the house. Within seconds, the entire structure seemed to vanish in a churning wall of impenetrable fog. What trickery is this? Hammond shouted, drawing his revolver. All units, prepare to... He never finished the command. From the smoke came a single rifle shot, so perfectly aimed that Hammond's epaulette was torn from his shoulder without the bullet touching his flesh. A warning, a demonstration. Then a voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing across the valley with supernatural clarity. You wanted the ghost, Colonel, McCullough's voice intoned. Now you've got him. What followed would be discussed in whispers for decades to come. The night the ghost who walks unleashed his full arsenal against the Butcher of Lawrence and his cavalry raiders, and somewhere to the north, unaware of the changed situation at Shadow Valley, Snake Matthews was executing his own secret plan, one that would collide with Hammond's vendetta in ways neither outlaw leader could possibly anticipate. 6 miles north of Shadow Valley, Snake Matthews knelt beside a crude map drawn in the dirt, explaining his plan to the 12 hardened men who'd remained loyal to him. These weren't hired guns or temporary allies. These were his core gang, men who'd ridden with him for years through blood and fire. Hammond's a fool, he growled, jabbing at the drawing with a stick. Military man thinks like a soldier. Frontal assault, overwhelming force. His scarred face twisted in contempt. That won't work against the ghost. His lieutenant, a one-eyed Mexican named Vasquez, nodded in agreement. So while the colonel keeps McCullough busy at the ranch, we hit him where it really hurts. Snake grinned, revealing a gold tooth that gleamed in the firelight. Every person McCullough's helped in this valley, every ranch he's protected, we burn them all. The plan was as simple as it was brutal. While Hammond's cavalry and the hired guns focused McCullough's attention on Shadow Valley, Snake and his core group would systematically destroy every Allied homestead in the region. By dawn, the valley would be ablaze from end to end, and the ghost would learn the price of defiance. We start with the Jensen widow's place, Snake continued, marking the location on his dirt map. Then the Carson Ranch, what's left of it. Peterson's farm, the Miller place. By sunrise, there won't be a standing building within 20 miles. What about the people? Asked Dawson, the youngest of his crew, but already a killer with 15 notches on his gun. Snake's eyes were cold as frozen lakes. No witnesses, no survivors. I want McCullough to know that everyone who ever trusted him, ever counted on his protection, died screaming his name. The others nodded, their faces showing neither approval nor disapproval. They were beyond such moral considerations, had been for years. They were simply instruments of Snake's will, extensions of his hatred. One problem, Vasquez pointed out. Jensen widow ain't at her place. She went to town yesterday, according to our spotters. Find her, Snake ordered. Check the hotel, the boarding houses. I want her dead by midnight. He straightened, checking his weapons. Everyone else, mount up. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dawn." As they prepared to leave, a rider approached their hidden camp. One of the scouts Snake had positioned to monitor Hammond's cavalry. "Boss," the man reported breathlessly, "something's happening at Shadow Valley. Some kind of smoke or fog covering everything. Can't see the house at all. And there's shooting. Lot of it." Snake's eyes narrowed. Hammond's made his move earlier than planned. He considered this development briefly. "Doesn't change anything. His fight, his problem. We stick to our plan." But as they mounted up, Snake couldn't shake a growing unease. Hammond was a butcher, but he was also a professional soldier. If he couldn't take down one retired scout... Vasquez, he decided suddenly. "Take 4 men. Check what's happening at Shadow Valley. Don't engage, just observe. If Hammond's winning, come back and report. If he's losing..." He paused, recalculating. "If he's losing, come back even faster. We'll need to change our approach." The Mexican nodded, selecting his men with quick gestures. They rode out immediately, heading south toward the distant sounds of gunfire. Snake led the remaining men toward their first target, the empty Jensen homestead. The small ranch sat peaceful in the moonlight, unaware of its approaching doom. "Burn it," Snake ordered as they dismounted. "Burn it all." His men moved with practiced efficiency, splashing coal oil on walls and furnishings. Within minutes, the first flames were spreading, hungrily devouring the dry timber. Snake watched with satisfaction. As the fire grew, smoke billowed into the night sky, a beacon of destruction visible for miles. The first message to the ghost was sent. "Peterson's farm next," he commanded, already turning his horse. "Should catch them still asleep." But as they mounted up, Dawson suddenly stiffened in his saddle, a look of surprise crossing his young face. Then he toppled sideways, landing in the dust with a heavy thud. The back of his head was missing, removed by a single rifle shot, fired from extreme range. "Ambush!" Snake roared, spurring his horse toward cover as his men scattered. More shots rang out, precise, methodical, coming from different directions. 2 more riders fell before they reached the tree line. "Who the hell is that?" gasped one of the survivors, pressing himself against a boulder. "McCullough can't be here. He's fighting Hammond." Snake's mind raced. This wasn't possible. The ghost couldn't be in 2 places at once. Unless... "It's a trap," he whispered, sudden understanding dawning. "It's all been a trap from the beginning." Miles away at Shadow Valley, Cooper crouched in a hidden rifle pit, watching Hammond's cavalry charge straight into McCullough's prepared killing ground. The scout had anticipated everything. The exact route the horsemen would take, the formation they would use, the moment panic would override training. The smokescreen, created by chemicals McCullough had prepared years earlier, had done its work perfectly. It concealed the defenders' positions while forcing the attackers to follow predictable paths that led directly into hidden pits, tripwires, and pre-sighted firing positions. Like hunting buffalo, McCullough had explained during their preparation. Once they start running, they can't change direction easily. All you need to do is be where they're going to be, not where they are. From his position, Cooper could see the results of this strategic thinking. Hammond's once formidable cavalry unit was in chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted contradictory orders, and the night flickered with muzzle flashes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And, through it all, the ghost moved like a shadow among shadows, appearing at precisely the right moment to eliminate key targets, then vanishing before retaliatory fire could find him. Cooper had been assigned a specific task: locate and neutralize Hammond himself. The colonel had disappeared in the initial confusion, likely falling back to a command position to regroup his forces. There, movement by the large boulder 300 yards east. Cooper adjusted his aim, recognizing Hammond's distinctive silhouette as the colonel shouted orders to his scattered men. Taking a deep breath, Cooper squeezed the trigger. His shot struck precisely where he'd aimed, shattering Hammond's right shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Not a killing shot. McCullough had been explicit about that. They needed Hammond alive for questioning. Inside the house, Sarah and Martha maintained steady fire from their positions, forcing the remaining attackers to keep their heads down. Billy moved between ammunition caches, ensuring everyone had what they needed when they needed it. "They're breaking," Billy called out, spotting movement through a gap in the smoke. "Hammond's men are retreating." It was true. The once proud cavalry unit was disintegrating, individual riders fleeing in all directions, abandoning their wounded and their cause in a desperate bid to escape the ghost's wrath. Cooper slipped from his firing position, working his way toward where Hammond had fallen. The colonel was gone, leaving only a blood trail that led toward a ravine to the east. "McCullough," Cooper called over their improvised communication system, a series of metal tubes that connected key defensive positions. "Hammond's wounded but moving, heading east toward Blackwater Ravine." The answer came not through the tubes but from directly behind him, making Cooper jump. "I see him," McCullough said, appearing like a phantom from the smoke. "Stay here. Maintain the defense. I'll handle Hammond." Before Cooper could respond, the scout was gone again, flowing through the battlefield like water through sand, tracking his wounded prey with single-minded focus. Back at the Jensen homestead, Snake and his remaining men were pinned down by an unseen sniper who seemed to have every escape route covered. 3 more gang members had been picked off, trying to reach their horses, each shot placed with surgical precision, wounding, not killing, but rendering them combat ineffective. "This is impossible," Vasquez hissed, blood seeping from a crease across his ribs. "One man can't cover all these angles." "It's not one man," Snake replied, his face ashen with realization. "It's the whole damn valley." And he was right. Throughout the region, ranchers, farmers, and townspeople who had suffered under the Laramie Gang's terror were taking up arms. McCullough had trained them, positioned them, prepared them for this night. Ordinary citizens transformed into a coordinated militia that now surrounded Snake's dwindling force. "We need to reach the horses," Snake decided, studying the terrain with desperate intensity. "There's a drainage ditch that runs behind the barn. Might give us enough cover to—" A rifle bullet kicked up dirt inches from his face, cutting off his words. "A warning shot! Matthews!" a voice called from the darkness. Snake recognized Marshal Harker's distinctive rasp. "You're surrounded! Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up!" Snake's mind raced through options, each worse than the last. His grand plan was collapsing around him. Hammond's force was apparently defeated. His own men were dead or scattered, and now he found himself trapped, outmaneuvered by the very prey he'd thought to hunt. "What's it going to be, Snake?" Vasquez asked, his one good eye reflecting fatalism. "Die! Here or hang later." Snake Matthews had spent 30 years building his reputation, his legend. He'd survived the war, the border conflicts, countless encounters with law enforcement and rival gangs. He wasn't going to end as a footnote in some marshal's report. "There's always another play," he muttered, reaching inside his vest to remove a small metal cylinder. "Always another card to turn." Vasquez recognized the device, his eye widening. Thought that was just for the ranch, just for McCullough. Plans change. Snake twisted the cylinder's cap, activating the complex mechanism inside. Desperate times, desperate measures. From outside their cover came Marshal Harker's voice again. "Last chance, Matthews. Surrender now or we open fire." Snake smiled grimly, checking his watch as the cylinder's timer began its countdown. "Tell them we're coming out," he instructed. "Vasquez, hands up, full surrender, get them in close, but do it." Snake's eyes had the flat, dead look of a man who'd made his final decision. "If I'm going to hell, I'm taking as many as I can with me." The device in his hand, stolen military, technology acquired at enormous expense, continued its silent countdown. Snake had planned it as a last resort against McCullough's ranch. Now it would serve a different purpose, ensuring that the legend of Snake Matthews ended not with surrender, but with apocalyptic violence. And miles away, as McCullough tracked the wounded Colonel Hammond through the darkness, he remained unaware that the night's true threat was yet to reveal itself. Colonel William Hammond dragged himself deeper into Blackwater Ravine, his shattered shoulder leaving a crimson trail on the rocks behind him. Pain clouded his vision, but decades of military discipline kept him moving, kept him thinking. He'd underestimated the ghost. They all had. This wasn't just some aging scout who'd gotten lucky against Snake's men. This was something else entirely. A predator who'd spent years preparing his killing ground with meticulous precision. Hammond had led 30 experienced cavalry raiders against what he thought was a simple ranch defense. Instead, he'd marched them straight into a slaughter pen designed by a master tactician. Finding a sheltered overhang, he collapsed against the stone wall, fumbling with his good hand to reload his revolver. 6 bullets left. Not much against what was coming, but he'd die fighting. Been planning your death for 5 years, he muttered, as if McCullough could hear him. Ever since I found out what you did to Richard. Tracked you across 3 territories. Allied with scum like Matthews, all for this moment. The sound of a pebble shifting somewhere above made him freeze. Strain as he might, Hammond could see nothing in the darkness, but he felt it, the presence of something watching, evaluating, preparing to strike. "Show yourself, ghost," he shouted, voice echoing through the ravine. "Face me like a man." Only silence answered him. Hammond fired blindly into the darkness, the shots deafening in the confined space. The echoes faded, leaving nothing but the night's quiet sounds. "Not how I work, Colonel." Hammond whirled. Somehow McCullough was behind him, materialized from the very shadows themselves. The scout stood 10 feet away, his Henry rifle held casually in one hand. All pretense of the fat, clumsy rancher was gone. What stood before Hammond now was the legend in its pure form. The ghost who walks. You're not human," Hammond gasped, raising his revolver. McCullough didn't even seem to move, yet suddenly the weapon was spinning away into the darkness. "Human enough," he replied calmly, "just better trained than most." Hammond straightened, against the rock wall, determined to die with dignity. "Get on with it then. Finish what you started with my brother." "Not yet." McCullough moved closer, his eyes reflecting starlight like a predatory animal's. "First, we talk. About Snake Matthews. About your real plan, don't know what you mean." But Hammond's eyes shifted away, betraying him. Cavalry raid was just a distraction. McCullough's voice was conversational, as if discussing the weather. "You never expected to take the ranch. You were keeping me occupied while Snake did something else." "What?" Hammond remained silent. "The hard way, then." McCullough moved with sudden, devastating speed. A moment later, Hammond was gasping in agony as the scout's thumb pressed precisely against a nerve bundle in his wounded shoulder. "Burning the outlying ranches," Hammond gasped. "Taking vengeance on everyone you've protected. Breaking you by destroying everything you care about." McCullough's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary concern quickly masked. "And your part in this, Confederate officer working with a common outlaw, doesn't fit your character, Colonel." Hammond laughed bitterly. "War changes men. When the South fell, I had nothing. No home, no future, no purpose, until I learned what you did to Richard." His face contorted with hatred. "Spent everything I had tracking you. When I found you'd settled here, I approached Matthews, offered him military expertise in exchange for help destroying you. And what does Snake get in return? Territory. Control of the whole valley once you're gone." Hammond grimaced as pain surged through his shoulder. "Man's ambitious, wants to build something lasting. Criminal empire with a respectable face. McCullough absorbed this, mind working through implications. There's more. Something you're not telling me. Nothing that matters now. Hammond's smile held genuine satisfaction despite his pain. By dawn, there won't be anything left of your life here. Everyone who ever trusted you, ever believed in you, will be dead. Matthews will make sure of that. The ghost was silent for a long moment, studying the wounded officer with cold calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, deeper, harder, utterly without mercy. "Thank you, Colonel. That's all I needed to know." Hammond's eyes widened in sudden fear. "Wait, I said we'd talk. We've talked." McCullough raised his rifle. "Now I finish what I started with your brother, not because you're Confederates, not because you're raiders." His finger tightened on the trigger, "but because you prey on the innocent. Always have, always will." The single shot echoed through Blackwater Ravine, then faded into silence. McCullough stood over Hammond's body, feeling nothing but a cold certitude that justice had been served. The peaceful rancher he'd pretended to be for 5 years would have felt remorse, perhaps even doubt. But that man was gone now, burned away, like morning mist beneath the harsh sun of necessity. The ghost had fully awakened, and he had work to finish. Cooper held his position at Shadow Valley's northern perimeter, watching the remnants of Hammond's cavalry scatter into the night. The battle for the ranch was effectively over. The hired guns had either fled or surrendered, and the cavalry unit was broken beyond recovery. But something felt wrong. The attack had been too disorganized, too easily defeated. Men like Hammond didn't rise to command positions by making such obvious tactical errors. A distraction, then. But for what? The answer came from an unexpected source. Billy appeared at his side, breathless from running. "Telegraph from town," the boy gasped, holding out a crumpled paper. "Marshal Harker sent it." Cooper read the message quickly, his face hardening. "Where's Sarah, Martha?" "Inside, tending the wounded. Get them. Tell them to prepare for immediate evacuation, then hitch the wagon, fastest team we've got." Billy hesitated. "But we won, didn't we? Hammond's men are running." "This was never about Shadow Valley," Cooper replied grimly. "Snakes burning every ranch and homestead in the region, taking revenge on anyone connected to McCullough. How many men does he have?" "Enough. And we're scattered, defending the ranch." Cooper was already moving, checking his ammunition, planning routes. "Need to warn McCullough. He's tracking Hammond, doesn't know what's happening elsewhere." Billy's young face showed determination beyond his years. "I'll find him. Know these hills better than anyone except Mr. McCullough himself." Cooper started to object, then reconsidered. The boy was right. He stood the best chance of locating the scout in the darkness. Be careful. Snake's men will shoot anything that moves. As Billy disappeared into the night, Cooper turned his attention to organizing the ranch's defense. If Snake had intended Shadow Valley as his final target all along, they needed to be ready. Miles away, Snake Matthews watched with cold satisfaction as Marshal Harker approached the Jensen homestead, hands raised in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Behind the lawman came several townspeople, similarly signaling their non-hostile intentions. "That's far enough, Marshal," Snake called from his position behind a water trough. "Any closer, and my men start shooting." Harker stopped, squinting into the darkness. "No need for more bloodshed, Matthews. It's over. McCullough's broken Hammonds. You force. Territorial governors sending militia. You can't win this. Maybe not," Snake conceded, "but I can make sure nobody else does either." Inside his vest, the metal cylinder continued its silent countdown. 3 minutes remaining. Not enough time for anyone to escape the blast radius. "Let my men go," Snake proposed. "They ride out, unharmed. I surrender to you, face trial. Nobody else needs to die tonight." It was a lie, of course. Nobody would be riding anywhere. But he needed to draw them closer, ensure maximum effect when the device detonated. Harker conferred briefly with those behind him, then called back, "Agreed. Send your men out first, weapons holstered." "Coming out now," Snake replied. He turned to Vasquez, speaking in a hurried whisper. "When I give the signal, run for the south gully. Might be just enough cover to survive the blast." The Mexican's single eye widened in understanding. "And you, Jefe?" Snake patted the cylinder in his vest. "Someone has to keep them distracted until it's too late." Standing slowly, hands raised, Snake emerged from behind the water trough. Vasquez and the 3 surviving gang members followed, their faces carefully blank, betraying nothing of what was about to happen. "That's good," Harker called, gesturing them forward. "Nice and easy." Snake observed the gathering through a professional's eyes. Beside Harker stood 3 deputies and about a dozen civilians, shopkeepers, ranchers, ordinary citizens who'd taken up arms to defend their community. Perfect. The blast would not only kill Harker, but decapitate the region's nascent resistance. They neared the midpoint between the positions. Snake saw his opportunity. A momentary confusion in the marshal's ranks as someone asked a question, attention diverted for just a second. "Now!" he hissed to Vasquez. The Mexican and the others broke instantly, sprinting for the southern gully as Snake dropped to one knee, drawing the hidden derringer from his boot. Chaos erupted. Deputies shouted, weapons were raised, but Snake wasn't trying to hit anyone. His shot went wide, designed only to create confusion, to focus all attention on him while the countdown reached its final seconds. "Stand down!" Harker bellowed, trying to regain control of the situation. "Everyone hold your fire!" Snake smiled, checking his pocket watch. 15 seconds remaining. He'd chosen the device carefully, military surplus from the war, designed for maximum casualty radius in open terrain. Expensive, nearly impossible to obtain, but worth every dollar for this moment. 10 seconds. "It's over, Matthews," Harker was saying, moving cautiously forward. "Drop the gun." 5 seconds. Snake straightened, arms spread wide in apparent surrender. "You're right, Marshal. It is over, for all of us. 3 seconds. "What are you talking about?" Harker's eyes narrowed with suspicion. 2 seconds. "Boom," Snake whispered. 1 second. A shot rang out. Not from anyone present, but from somewhere in the darkness to the west. Snake felt a sharp impact, looked down, in disbelief at the spreading crimson stain on his chest, precisely over his heart. As he collapsed to his knees, a figure emerged from the shadows. McCullough, rifle still raised, covering the distance between them with inhuman speed. The scout reached him just as Snake toppled forward, hands frantically scrabbling at his vest, trying to reach the device before McCullough tore open Snake's vest, revealing the metal cylinder with its clockwork timer just as it reached 0. With one fluid motion, he hurled it toward an empty field, then threw himself over the outlaw's body. The explosion ripped through the night, a thunderclap of destruction that flattened nearby outbuildings and shattered every window for half a mile. But the casualties were minimal. McCullough's quick action had directed the blast away from the gathered townspeople. As dust and debris rained down, the scout rose, his expression unreadable. Snake Matthews lay dead at his feet, victim of a shot that should have been impossible in darkness at that range. But nothing was impossible for the ghost. Not anymore. "Been tracking you since you left Hammond," McCullough said to the corpse, as if it could still hear him. "Heard every word of your plan, witnessed every move." He turned to Harker, who was staring at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "Marshal, I believe you're looking for the remains of the Laramie Gang. Most are, scattered through the hills. The leaders won't be troubling anyone ever again." Harker found his voice with difficulty. "McCullough, what you just did, that shot, it was necessary." The scout's voice was devoid of emotion. "They came to my valley, threatened my people, left me no choice. As murmurs spread through the gathered townspeople, McCullough surveyed the scene with a tactician's eye. Snake was dead, Hammond eliminated, their forces scattered or surrendered. But the night's work wasn't finished. Not yet. "Where's Vasquez?" he demanded. "Mexican, One Eye, Snake's lieutenant." "Ran south during the confusion," a deputy reported, "with 3 others." McCullough nodded, already calculating pursuit routes, intercept points. The ghost was fully awakened now, the transformation complete. No more pretending to be something he wasn't. No more hiding his true nature behind a facade of peaceful ranching. "Secure the area, Marshal," he ordered, checking his weapons. "I'll handle Vasquez." "John," Harker said quietly, using McCullough's first name. "It's over. Let the law take it from here." The ghost turned to him, and something in his eyes made the marshal step back involuntarily. "It's not over until every last one of them is accounted for. That was always the mission. Track the enemy. Eliminate the threat. Protect the innocent." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been running from what I am for 5 years. No more." As he melted into the darkness, following Vasquez's trail with a scout's unerring precision, the townspeople watched in silence. They'd heard stories about the ghost who walks, about the legend who had haunted the Apache wars. Tonight, they'd seen those stories come to life, and somewhere in the Wyoming night, as the battle's tide turned irrevocably in their favor, the last members of the Laramie Gang were about to discover why that legend had once made America's deadliest warriors tremble in fear. Vasquez and his 3 surviving men fled south through broken country, pushing their horses to dangerous speeds, despite the darkness. The one-eyed Mexican kept glancing back, expecting to see pursuit, though logic told him none could follow there. Trail before daylight. Logic, however, had nothing to do with the cold fear clutching at his spine. He'd seen what happened at Shadow Valley, seen Hammond's professional cavalry unit shattered by an enemy they couldn't even identify. Seen Snake Matthews, the most dangerous man he'd ever known, fall to an impossible shot in absolute darkness. This wasn't a man they were fleeing. It was something else, something that defied normal limitations. "Where we headed, Vasquez?" gasped. Hawkins, the youngest of the survivors, barely 20, but already wanted in 3 territories. "Old mining camp," Vasquez replied, guiding his lathered horse through a narrow ravine. "Black Rock Canyon, defensible position, supplies cached there for emergencies." What he didn't say was that the mining camp had been Snake's contingency plan all along, a last refuge if everything went wrong. Stocked with ammunition, food, even gold for a fresh start somewhere far away. Snake had always understood the value of preparation, of having an escape route when plans collapsed. "How far?" asked Morgan, a former bounty hunter who'd crossed. "The line to outlawry years ago, 3 miles. Over that ridge, then west through the dry creek bed." The 4th man, a silent killer known only as the Preacher, nodded his understanding. Of them all, the Preacher seemed least affected by the night's disasters, his gaunt face betraying nothing of his thoughts. They pushed on, horses stumbling with exhaustion, until finally the abandoned mining camp appeared before them. A cluster of weathered buildings nestled against the canyon wall, half hidden by scrub pine and shadow. "We made it," Hawkins breathed, relief evident in his voice. The Preacher spoke for the first time that night, his voice soft but carrying. "No, we've just entered our tomb." The others looked at him sharply, but the tall gunman simply dismounted, leading his horse toward the main building. "He's tracking us, has been since we left the homestead. We've just led him exactly where he wants us." "Impossible," Morgan sputtered. "No man could follow this trail at night, not even an Indian tracker." "He's not a man," the Preacher replied simply. "He's a ghost, and ghosts don't need light to see." Vasquez felt his remaining eye twitch nervously. The Preacher had always been strange, claiming to hear voices, to see visions, but his instincts were rarely wrong. If he said they were being tracked inside, he ordered, suddenly uncomfortable in the open, secure the perimeter, set watches, nobody sleeps tonight. The mining camp's main building had once been an assay office, its thick stone walls designed to protect valuable ore samples. The outlaws quickly fortified it, barricading windows, establishing firing positions, distributing the cached supplies Snake had prepared. 6 rifles, 4 shotguns, ammunition for a small war, Morgan reported, inspecting their arsenal. Food and water for a week, even medical supplies. Snake thought of everything, Hawkins said with grim admiration. Not everything, the preacher contradicted softly. Or he'd still be alive. Vasquez climbed to the 2nd floor, using his spyglass to survey the surrounding terrain in the moonlight. Nothing moved, no sign of pursuit. But the preacher's words had unsettled him, awakened old superstitions from his childhood in Sonora. La fantasma, he muttered, unconsciously making the sign of the cross. El que camina, the one who walks. 500 yards away, concealed in a natural depression beneath a gnarled juniper, McCullough studied the mining camp through his spyglass. The outlaws had chosen well, or rather, Snake had chosen well when he established this fallback position. Good sight lines, easily defensible approaches, multiple escape routes if needed. But the Ghost had been hunting men like these for decades. Every strength could become a weakness if properly exploited. Settling more comfortably into his observation post, McCullough began the methodical analysis that had kept him alive through 15 years of frontier warfare. Identifying guard positions, noting patterns in their movements, calculating fields of fire, mapping blind spots in their defenses. 4 men, experienced killers all, desperate now, which made them dangerous, but also frightened, which made them vulnerable to psychological tactics. He'd take his time, let them stew in their fear. Wear them down with uncertainty before making his move. The Ghost was patient. Death could wait until dawn. Back at Shadow Valley, Cooper organized the remaining defenders, not certain what new threats might emerge before morning. Hammond's wounded. Men had been rounded up and secured in the barn. The hired guns who hadn't fled were similarly detained. "Any word from McCullough?" Sarah asked, bringing him coffee as he kept watch from the upper floor. Nothing. Cooper's young face showed concern. But Billy should have found him by now. As if summoned by his words, Billy appeared at the edge of the property, riding hard. Cooper hurried downstairs to meet him. "Did you find him?" he demanded as the boy dismounted. Billy nodded, catching his breath. "At the Jensen place. Snake's dead. Some kind of explosion, but Mr. McCullough contained it somehow." His eyes were wide with what he'd witnessed. Never seen anything like it. The way he moved, the way he shot, it wasn't human. What about the rest of the Laramie Gang? Most scattered or surrendered to Marshal Harker. But 4 made it out. Vasquez and 3 others. Mr. McCullough's tracking them to some mining camp in Black Rock Canyon. Cooper processed this information quickly. He's going alone, against 4 professional killers. Tried to volunteer to help, Billy admitted. He told me to get back here, secure the ranch, said he works better alone. The boy's face showed conflicting emotions, relief at being spared the danger, shame at the same feeling. Should we go after him, provide backup? Cooper considered the question carefully. His instinct was to ride immediately to McCullough's aid. 4 against 1 were dangerous odds, even for the legendary scout, but he'd seen the Ghost in action now, understood what Billy meant about movements that seemed beyond human capability. And more importantly, he'd begun to grasp how McCullough's mind worked, the layers of strategy, the careful calculus of threat and response. No, he decided finally. We follow his instructions, secure the ranch, protect Sarah and Martha. That's what he's counting on us to do. Billy nodded, accepting the logic even as concern lined his young face. Will he be okay, alone against 4 of Snake's best? Cooper found himself smiling grimly. He's not alone, Billy. He's got 15 years of Apache hunting experience with him, and from what I've seen tonight, those 4 outlaws are the ones who should be worried. At the mining camp, tension mounted as hours passed without sign of pursuit. Each sound, a pebble dislodged by wind, a nightbird's call, brought weapons up and fingers to triggers. "This is madness," Morgan muttered around midnight, peering into darkness that revealed nothing. "We should keep moving. Put distance between us and whatever's back there." "And go where?" Vasquez demanded. "Every lawman in 3 territories will be looking for us by morning. We need rest, supplies, a plan. We need a miracle," the preacher commented from his position by a boarded window. "Or last rites." "Shut up with that talk," Hawkins snapped, nerves fraying. "Nobody's dying tonight." The preacher turned slowly, his emaciated face ghostly in the lantern light. "We're already dead, boy. Just haven't stopped breathing yet." A tense silence followed, broken suddenly by a sound that made every man freeze, the clear, unmistakable metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the canyon with supernatural clarity. "He's here," the preacher whispered, an almost exalted tone in his voice. "Where?" Morgan hissed, spinning in place, rifle sweeping the darkness beyond their barricaded windows. "I don't see anything." Another sound answered him, a low, eerie whistle that raised the hair on their necks. A signal, perhaps, though none could identify its meaning or source. "Hold position," Vasquez ordered, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his single eye. "Conserve ammunition. Don't shoot at shadows." For the next hour, the psychological assault continued. Strange sounds, movements glimpsed at the corner of vision that vanished when directly observed. The sensation of being watched, evaluated, measured for a coffin. Apache tactics, Morgan realized aloud. He's using their psychological warfare techniques, breaking us down before he attacks. If he attacks, Vasquez countered, might just be scaring us into doing something stupid, making us waste ammunition, lose sleep. Working pretty well, isn't it? Hawkins laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. The preacher alone seemed unaffected, watching the night with the serene acceptance of a man who had already embraced his fate. "He's out there," he said calmly, "watching, planning. Every minute that passes, he learns more about our defenses, identifies another weakness, prepares another trap." "Shut up!" Hawkins shouted, control finally breaking. "Just shut your damn mouth. Make me." The preacher's challenge was issued without heat, a simple statement of fact. As tension between the outlaws neared breaking point, a new sound cut through the night, the distant but unmistakable approach of horses. "Many horses, moving at speed, reinforcements?" Morgan suggested hopefully. Vasquez used his spyglass, straining to make out details in the moonlight. "Riders coming from the north, 15, maybe 20. His remaining eye widened. "Cavalry uniforms, Hammond's men." Hope surged through the trapped outlaws. If Hammond's cavalry had escaped Shadow Valley, perhaps the night's disaster wasn't complete after all. Perhaps they still had allies in this fight. "Signal them," Vasquez ordered, reaching for a lantern. "Let them know we're here." Only the preacher remained skeptical, watching the approaching riders with narrowed eyes. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "The formation, it's not right." But Vasquez was already flashing the lantern, using the simple code the Laramie Gang had established for night operations. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long again. "We are here. Allies. Approach." The riders changed direction, now heading directly for the mining camp. But as they drew closer, details became clearer, and hope curdled into new fear. "Those aren't Hammond's men," the preacher announced with grim certainty. "Those are marshals and territorial militia." Vasquez's hands trembled as he verified this. Through his spyglass, the approaching force wasn't rescue, it was doom, law enforcement guided somehow to their secret refuge, coming to finish what McCullough had started. "We're trapped," Morgan stated the obvious. Canyon walls behind us. Marshals ahead. We fight, Vasquez decided, desperation lending certainty to his voice. Make them pay for every inch. Maybe create an opening. Break through their lines. As the lawmen deployed around the mining camp, systematically cutting off every potential escape route, a lone figure rode forward into the moonlight. Marshal Harker, his badge catching the pale glow, raising a speaking trumpet to his lips. Vasquez, you and your men are surrounded. Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up. Inside their stone fortress, the outlaws exchanged glances, each reading his own fate in the other's eyes. Options, Morgan asked, surprisingly calm, now that the end was clear. Surrender and hang, Vasquez replied, or fight and die. Some choice, Hawkins laughed bitterly. The preacher moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the barricade. There's a third option, he said quietly. Look carefully at those riders. Study their positions. Vasquez joined him, using his spyglass to examine the deployment. Slowly, understanding dawned. They've left a gap. Southern approach. Small, but a man on a fast horse might make it through. Exactly, the preacher nodded. One man, not four. The implications hung in the air between them. One might escape. The others would be sacrificed as distraction. Who? Hawkins asked, voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, another sound reached them, soft footsteps on the roof above. Something or someone was moving up there directly over their heads. He's here, the preacher whispered, eyes lifting to the ceiling. The ghost has come for his due. Outside, Marshal Harker raised his speaking trumpet again. Last chance, Vasquez. Surrender now or we open fire. Time had run out. Decisions had to be made. Inside the mining camp's assay office, the last members of the Laramie Gang prepared to meet their fate. Whether at the hands of the law or at the ghostly touch of the scout who had stalked them through the darkness, the siege had begun, and for these men there would be no dawn. The footsteps on the roof ceased abruptly, leaving an ominous silence that pressed against the outlaws' ears like a physical weight. Vasquez motioned his men to positions around the room, covering every possible entry point. Doors, windows, even the stone chimney that rose from one corner. "Steady," he whispered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Wait for a target. Make every shot count." The preacher stood calmly by the southern window, studying the marshal's deployment with professional detachment. "Gaps. Still there," he observed. "Maintained deliberately. They want one of us to try for it." "Trap?" Morgan asked, squinting through his rifle sights at the distant lawman. "Obviously." The preacher's thin lips curved in something approximating a smile. "But a trap requires bait, and bait can sometimes escape the snare." Hawkins paced nervously, between positions, checking and rechecking his weapons. "Someone's got to make a decision. We can't just wait here for—" The room plunged into pitch blackness as every lantern extinguished simultaneously, seemingly of their own accord. No breeze had disturbed them. No one had moved near them. One moment light, the next darkness so complete it felt like burial. "What the hell?" Morgan's voice betrayed his fear. "Nobody move," Vasquez ordered. "It's what he wants. Stay in position. Eyes will adjust." But before their vision could adapt, a new sound filled the room, the whisper of metal against leather, followed by the distinctive double click of a revolver being cocked inside their own stronghold. Inches from where Hawkins stood, the young outlaw fired blindly toward the sound, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the room in a frozen tableau of fear and confusion. His bullet embedded itself in the far wall, striking nothing. Then came the voice, McCullough's voice, seemingly emanating from the very center of the room, though none had heard him enter. 4 men, 6 shots in a standard revolver. Odds favor me." Vasquez fired toward the voice, another futile muzzle flash illuminating empty space where the scout should have been. "I'm not there." Now the voice came from behind Vasquez, impossibly close. "Never shoot at sounds. Apache lesson number 1. Morgan and Hawkins fired simultaneously, bullets crossing the room to strike nothing but wood and stone. "Your positions are mapped, your weapons counted, your strengths assessed." McCullough's voice shifted again, now seeming to come from directly above them. "You have one chance. Surrender to Marshal Harker, face trial. Most of you will hang, but it'll be quicker than the alternatives." "Show yourself, coward," Hawkins shouted, terror making his voice crack. "Fight like a man." A low, cold laugh answered him. "I don't fight like a man. That's why I'm still alive after 15 years hunting Apache, why I survived when hundreds of real men died screaming in the desert." Something brushed past Morgan in the darkness. A whisper of movement, gone before he could react. The former. Bounty Hunter swore, spinning wildly, firing at shadows. "5 shots left in your rifle, Morgan," McCullough's disembodied voice observed. "2 in your backup revolver. When they're gone, what then?" "How does he know our names?" Hawkins whispered, panic rising. "How does he know our weapons?" "Because he's been watching us for hours," the preacher answered calmly. "Learning, planning, as I told you he would." Vasquez made a decision. "Enough of this. Morgan, Hawkins, lay down covering fire. Aim for the windows, the door. Preacher and I will make for the horses. Try to break through that gap in their lines." "Won't make it," the preacher contradicted. "That's not a real opening. It's his killing ground. You got a better idea?" Vasquez snarled. Before the preacher could answer, a new sound reached them. The unmistakable metallic scrape of a match being struck. A small flame bloomed in the center of the room, illuminating McCullough's face from below, casting demonic shadows across features that showed neither hatred nor anger, only implacable purpose. The outlaws froze, weapons trained on the scout, who made no move to defend himself. He simply stood there, match burning down toward his fingers, eyes reflecting the tiny flame as he studied each man in turn. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Surrender or die." Hawkins broke first. Desperation, overcoming reason. He fired directly at McCullough's exposed face, a point-blank shot that couldn't possibly miss, except it did. The match extinguished, plunging the room back into darkness. Hawkins's bullet struck the wall behind where McCullough had been standing. A split second earlier, before the young outlaw could fire again, something struck his wrist with surgical precision, the ghost's knife, thrown with inhuman accuracy, severing tendons without touching bone. Hawkins screamed, dropping his gun, clutching his useless hand. In the confusion, the preacher made his move, but not toward the door. Instead, he calmly laid down his weapons and stepped away from them. "I surrender," he announced to the darkness. "Enough blood has been spilled tonight." "Traitor!" Vasquez shouted, swinging his gun toward the preacher's voice. Before he could fire, something heavy struck him from behind. McCullough, moving with the silent precision of a lifetime, spent hunting in darkness. The Mexican went down hard, his shot going wild, his single eye staring up at a shadow darker than the surrounding gloom. "Your choice is made," the ghost whispered. Nearby, Morgan was experiencing his own nightmare. Unable to see, he backed toward where he believed the wall to be, only to find empty space where solid stone should have stood. Somehow, in the darkness and confusion, he'd lost all orientation, all sense of the room's layout. "What's happening?" he gasped, genuine terror in his voice. "Where am I?" No answer came, only the sound of Hawkins sobbing, the preacher's calm breathing, and somewhere the nearly silent movement of the ghost as he stalked his final prey. Morgan fired randomly, each muzzle flash revealing nothing but empty room. 4 shots, 3, 2. His final bullet spent, he dropped his rifle and drew his revolver with trembling hands. "Stay back," he shouted at the darkness. "I've still got 6 shots!" 2, McCullough's voice corrected from directly behind him. And both rounds are dampened, powder reduced by approximately 30% during your dinner, enough to fire, not enough to kill. Morgan whirled, triggering both remaining shots point blank into the darkness. The reduced charges made. The bullets drop harmlessly at McCullough's feet as the scout's hand closed around Morgan's throat with implacable force. How? The outlaw's question died as consciousness fled. Outside, Marshal Harker watched the mining camp with growing unease. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since the shooting started inside. Now silence reigned, broken only by the occasional unintelligible shout or brief muzzle flash visible through boarded windows. "Should we move in?" his deputy asked nervously. "They could be killing each other in there." "No," Harker replied, understanding dawning. "They're not killing each other. He's hunting them, one by one." As if confirming his assessment, the mining camp's door suddenly opened. A tall, emaciated figure, the one they called the preacher, emerged with hands raised high. "Don't shoot," he called. "I'm surrendering." Marshals swarmed forward, securing the outlaw with practiced efficiency. Harker approached once the preacher was safely restrained. "Where are the others?" he demanded. The preacher's face held an expression that might have been awe or perhaps fear. "Still inside, with the ghost." Before Harker could question him further, another figure appeared in the doorway, Hawkins, clutching his bloody wrist, face pale with shock. Like the preacher, he offered no resistance as marshals took him into custody. "2 down, 2 to go," Harker muttered, watching the silent building with growing respect and trepidation. McCullough was systematically dismantling the Laramie Gang's most dangerous killers, and doing it with a theatrical flair that would become legend throughout the territory. Inside, Vasquez regained consciousness to find himself propped against a wall, hands and feet bound with his own belt and bandana. Across the room, McCullough sat calmly on a chair, lantern once again lit, cleaning blood from a wicked-looking knife. "Morgan," Vasquez croaked, looking around the now empty room. "Alive," McCullough answered without looking up. "Outside with the marshals, along with the preacher and Hawkins. Why not me?" Now the scout raised his eyes, studying Vasquez with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "Because you're Snake's second, the one who knows. All his operations, all his contacts, all his secrets." Understanding dawned on the Mexican's face. "You want information." "Need information," McCullough corrected. "Snake was planning something bigger than just taking my ranch, something that involved Hammond, involved military-grade explosives, involved resources no simple outlaw gang should have access to." Vasquez laughed bitterly. "And you think I'll talk? Tell you everything in exchange for what? My life? No, your life is forfeit no matter what. Too many dead by your hand." The scout resumed, cleaning his knife with methodical precision. "But how you die, quick and clean at the end of a rope, or slow and messy out here where no one can hear, that's negotiable." The threat hung in the air between them, made more terrifying by McCullough's matter-of-fact delivery. This wasn't a man making idle threats. This was a professional explaining simple facts. Vasquez swallowed hard. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, starting with the military explosives. Where did Snake get them? Who was his supplier?" "Hammond," Vasquez answered quickly. "The colonel brought them when he joined us. Said they were leftovers from the war, stockpiled for a rebellion that never happened." McCullough nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Snake had plans," Vasquez went on, words tumbling out faster now. "Big plans. Not just controlling this valley, but the whole territory. Had connections in Washington, in state government. People who looked respectable but were on his payroll." "Names," McCullough demanded. "Judge Hollister in Cheyenne. Deputy, Territorial Governor Rawlins, 3 marshals including Bradford from the Eastern District. Vasquez's single eye darted nervously as he betrayed his former employer's secrets. Snake kept records, detailed records, names, payments, blackmail. Material. Where? Lockbox, U.S. Bank in Laramie, under the name William Sedgwick. McCullough absorbed this information, mind already calculating implications, forming plans. And Hammond? How did he connect with Snake? Approached us 6 months ago. Offered military expertise, explosives, trained men. Said he had personal business with you, wanted our help taking you down. Vasquez hesitated, then added, Snake didn't trust him, kept his own plans separate. That's why he sent us to burn the outlying ranches while Hammond attacked your place. Smart of him, McCullough acknowledged. Hammond was using Snake, would have eliminated him once I was dead. He studied Vasquez thoughtfully. Anything else I should know? The Mexican hesitated, weighing his options, then slumped in defeat. Weapons cache. Biggest one. Old mission ruins near the Mexican border. Enough guns and ammunition to supply a small army. Snake was planning something big for this fall. Never told us what. McCullough stood, satisfied. Marshal Harker will want to hear all this. Repeat it to him exactly as you told me, and I'll put in a word for a quick hanging rather than a slow one. You're turning me over to the marshals? Surprise and relief mingled in Vasquez's voice. Thought you'd kill me yourself. Considered it, McCullough admitted, hauling the outlaw to his feet. But some things belong to the law. Even I recognize that line. As they emerged into the pre-dawn, light, Marshal Harker approached cautiously, hand on his revolver. The lawman's eyes widened at the sight of Vasquez bound but alive, McCullough guiding him firmly, but without unnecessary roughness. He's all yours, Marshal, the scout announced, passing his prisoner over. Has some interesting information about Snake's operations, political connections, corruption in high places. Harker accepted custody of the Mexican, signaling deputies to secure him, and Morgan by the north wall, unconscious but alive. McCullough surveyed the assembled lawmen, noting their expressions, a mixture of awe, fear, and respect that he recognized all too well from his days hunting Apache. The Laramie Gang is finished. Their leaders dead, their men scattered or captured. But there's more work to be done, corruption to be exposed, justice to be delivered. That's the law's job, Harker reminded him, though without much conviction. McCullough smiled faintly. Some of it, yes, the part that happens in courtrooms and with signed papers. His eyes drifted to the eastern horizon, where the first faint glow of dawn was appearing. But some justice needs to be delivered more directly. Before Harker could respond, the scout was moving toward his waiting horse, a magnificent animal that seemed as much a creature of shadow and silence as its master. With fluid grace that belied his size, McCullough mounted, gathering the reins. "Where are you going?" Harker called after him. McCullough turned in the saddle, his silhouette sharp against the lightening sky. For a moment, the peaceful rancher was visible again in his features, the man who had tried to escape his violent past, who had sought redemption in quiet work and simple pleasures. Then that man vanished, replaced by the legend. The ghost, the implacable hunter who had tracked America's deadliest enemies through impossible terrain and brought them to justice. "Hunting," he answered simply. With that, he urged his horse forward, disappearing into the half-light of dawn like the phantom he was named for. The scout's last ride wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Behind him, lawmen and captured outlaws alike watched his departure in silence, somehow understanding that they had witnessed something beyond ordinary experience, the rebirth of a legend they'd thought consigned to history. The ghost who walks was abroad in Wyoming Territory, and somewhere corrupt judges, bought officials, and criminal conspirators who believed themselves safe behind respectability shivered without knowing why, as if sensing the approach of judgment from which there would be no appeal. Summer faded into autumn, and the Wyoming landscape transformed into a tapestry of gold and crimson. 3 months had passed since the night of fire and blood that had ended the Laramie Gang's reign of terror. 3 months of healing, rebuilding, and quiet transformation. Deputy James Cooper stood on the porch of Crow's Creek's newly expanded marshal's office, watching townspeople go about their business in the crisp October morning. The changes were subtle but profound. Shopkeepers no longer nervously eyed strangers, women walked unescorted down side streets, children played freely in previously abandoned lots. Fear had lifted from the valley like morning mist before the sun. "Thinking deep thoughts, Marshal Cooper?" Martha Carson asked, approaching with a basket of fresh bread. After losing her home, she'd moved to town permanently, opening a small bakery that had quickly become the heart of local social life. "Still just Deputy Marshal," Cooper corrected with a smile, accepting the offered loaf. "Though Harker keeps threatening to retire and leave me the badge. You've earned it." Martha's weathered face turned serious. "Everyone knows who really restored order around here after that night." Cooper shook his head. "I just helped clean up. The real work was done by McCullough." At the mention of that name, both fell silent. Throughout the territory, the ghost who walks had become something more than a man, a legend, a symbol, a warning to those who preyed on the innocent. Stories of his exploits had spread, growing with each retelling until they approached the supernatural. Some said he could see in perfect darkness. Others claimed bullets passed through him without effect. Still others insisted he could appear and disappear at will, covering impossible distances in minutes. Cooper knew better. He'd seen the man behind the myth. Skilled beyond ordinary measure, yes, but human nonetheless. A man who bled, tired, and carried the weight of his violent capabilities with grim responsibility. "Any word?" Martha asked softly. Cooper shook his head. "Nothing direct. Just rumors. Stories from up north about corrupt officials suddenly resigning. Tales from the southern territories about gunmen with connections to the Laramie Gang found dead in impossible circumstances." "He's still hunting," Martha nodded, unsurprised, "finishing what he started." The deputy's hand unconsciously touched the leather-bound book he now carried everywhere, McCullough's Scout Journal, filled with techniques, observations, and hard-won wisdom from 15 years of frontier warfare. A legacy passed to him. On that fateful night, the judge sentenced Vasquez and Morgan to hang next week, Cooper noted, changing the subject. The preacher got 20 years territorial prison for turning state's evidence. Hawkins 10, on account of his youth and lesser charges. "Justice," Martha approved, though it wouldn't have happened without the ghost. A rider appeared at the end of the street, moving at a steady trot toward the marshal's office. Cooper recognized Billy Carter, now working full-time at Shadow Valley Ranch under its new management. "Deputy," Billy greeted, dismounting smoothly. The events of that night had aged the boy, turning him almost overnight into a serious young man with watchful eyes. "Got a telegram from Cheyenne you might want to see. Sarah asked me to bring it directly." Cooper scanned the message, eyebrows rising. "Deputy Governor Rawlins found dead in his office. Apparent suicide. Note, confessing. To corruption, ties to criminal organizations." "Another one?" Martha asked. "Fourth territorial official in 2 months, Cooper confirmed, all with connections to the Laramie Gang, according to Vasquez's testimony. Billy's expression remained carefully neutral. "Mighty convenient, all these confessions and suicides." "Mighty convenient indeed," Cooper agreed, folding the telegram. "How are things at the ranch?" Good. Sarah's got the place running smooth as clockwork. Cattle are fattening up for winter. New hands working out well." Billy hesitated, then added, "Had a visitor last night. After dark." Cooper's eyes sharpened. "Him?" Billy nodded. "Didn't stay long. Just checked the property. Spoke privately with Sarah for a while, then rode out before dawn. Left something for you, though." He reached into his saddlebag, retrieving a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Cooper unwrapped it carefully, revealing a U.S. Marshal's badge, not a deputy's star, but the full shield of a chief marshal. With it was a letter bearing the territorial governor's seal and signature, appointing James Cooper as the new federal marshal for Wyoming's Eastern District. "How did he—" Cooper began, then shook his head in wonderment. "Never mind. I probably don't want to know." Martha peered at the badge and papers. "Seems our ghost has friends in high places now. Or the previous occupants of those high places had unfortunate accidents," Billy suggested with dark humor. Cooper studied the appointment letter thoughtfully. "Did he say anything else? Leave any message?" "Just that you'd know what to do with this." Billy gestured at the badge. "Said you had the book, had the training, had the heart. Said the territory needs men who understand the balance between law and justice." The weight of responsibility settled on Cooper's shoulders, not uncomfortably, but as a mantle he'd been preparing to wear without fully realizing it. McCullough had been grooming him, he now understood, teaching him, testing him, preparing him for this moment. "Will you take it?" Martha asked, studying his face. Cooper nodded slowly. "I will. Someone needs to stand between the innocent and those who would prey on them." His fingers traced the book's worn leather binding. "Someone who understands there are times for courts and juries, and times for other methods." Billy smiled, satisfied. "He said you'd say something like that." Later that afternoon, Cooper rode out to Shadow Valley Ranch, wanting to speak with Sarah Jensen about his new appointment and what it might mean for the region. The ranch had transformed in subtle ways over recent months. New hands, improved defenses, a watchfulness that went beyond normal ranching precautions. Sarah met him by the corral, her face showing the calm competence that had helped her survive both widowhood and the night of terror. She'd taken over McCullough's business affairs completely, managing the ranch with remarkable skill. "Marshal Cooper," she greeted him with a knowing smile. "Congratulations on the appointment." "News travels fast," he observed, dismounting. "In some circles." She led him toward the main house, now restored from the damage suffered during the siege. "He said you'd come today, said you'd have questions." Inside, they settled in McCullough's study, still maintained exactly as he'd left it, as if awaiting his return. The chest containing his scout gear stood open now, rather than locked away, its contents occasionally missing, then replaced without comment. "Is he coming back?" Cooper asked directly. "To stay, I mean." Sarah considered the question, her eyes drifting to the window where Shadow Valley stretched to the distant mountains. "Not soon. Maybe not ever. Not permanently. He's found his purpose. Again." She turned back to Cooper. "The man who lived here, the rancher who raised cattle and attended town socials, that was a role he was playing, a life he thought he wanted. And now the ghost walks again," she said simply. "Hunting. Corruption that goes far beyond Snake Matthews and local outlaws. Following trails that lead to territorial capitals, to Washington, to corporate boardrooms." Cooper nodded slowly, understanding. The Laramie Gang had been merely the visible symptom of a deeper disease, corruption that infected government, business, even law enforcement itself. McCullough was treating the cause now, not just the symptoms. "He left you in charge," Cooper observed, "of everything." For now. Sarah's smile held secrets she clearly had no intention of sharing. "The ranch provides cover, resources, a base of operations when needed. The cattle business generates legitimate income that supports other activities. Dangerous activities. Justice is always dangerous, Marshal Cooper." Her use of his new title was deliberate, pointed, "as you're about to discover." They talked for another hour, about the territory's future, about arrangements for maintaining communication, about contingency plans should certain powerful interests realize what was happening and strike back. As Cooper prepared to leave, Sarah handed him a sealed envelope. "From him, for your eyes only." Alone on the ride back to town, Cooper broke the seal and read McCullough's letter. Instructions, observations, and warnings written in the scout's precise hand. Names of men to trust, others to watch. Locations of cached supplies and emergency rendezvous points. A network already established, waiting for Cooper to assume his place within it. The letter's conclusion was both promise and warning. The ghost walks where normal men cannot. Beyond law, beyond oversight, beyond the constraints that bind legitimate authority. Your badge gives you power I can never claim. Just as my shadows give me freedom you must never seek. Together, we serve the same purpose. Justice for those who have no voice. Protection for those who cannot protect themselves. The battle that began in Shadow Valley will continue for years. Be ready. J.M. Cooper carefully burned the letter as instructed, watching the ashes scatter in the autumn wind. He understood now what McCullough had been preparing him for. Not just a marshal's badge, but a partnership unlike any in territorial history. Official and shadow, law and justice, each operating in realms the other could not enter, yet working toward the same goal. Winter came early to Wyoming that year, blanketing the territory in pristine white that concealed the blood spilled during summer's violence. In Crow's Creek, life settled into peaceful routines under Marshal Cooper's watchful protection. The Laramie Gang was no more. Vasquez and Morgan had met their fate at the gallows. Most of the surviving members had fled the territory, while others had been systematically tracked down by unseen hands, their bodies discovered in circumstances that raised questions but provided no answers. Martha Carson's bakery became the town's gathering place, her strength and resilience an inspiration to others rebuilding their lives. The widow's hands remained busy, her spirit unbroken despite her losses. Sarah Jensen continued managing Shadow Valley Ranch with remarkable success, expanding its operations, hiring more hands, many of them suspiciously skilled beyond normal. Ranch work, many with military backgrounds similar to McCullough's own. Billy Carter grew into his new responsibilities, learning not just ranching but other skills taught by occasional visitors who arrived without warning and departed without farewell. Shadow Valley was becoming something more than a simple cattle operation, a fortress, a sanctuary, a base for operations that few understood and fewer questioned. And throughout the territory, stories spread of justice delivered in darkness. Corrupt officials exposed by evidence that appeared from nowhere. Criminal operations dismantled by tactics no ordinary lawman would conceive. Predators who discovered too late that they had become prey. Official reports attributed these events to Marshal Cooper's diligent law enforcement, to territorial reforms, to changing times. Those who knew better remained silent, understanding that some legends serve their purpose best when spoken in whispers. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently over Crow's Creek, Cooper stood alone in his office, reviewing reports of recent activities. Throughout his jurisdiction, crime had fallen to unprecedented levels. Communities once terrorized by outlaws now thrived in peace. Justice, both official and otherwise, had transformed the territory. A sound at the window made him turn, hand instinctively moving to his gun. But it was only snow falling from the roof. Nothing more. Or so he thought, until he noticed the small package on his desk, a package that hadn't been there moments before. Inside was a single Apache arrowhead, carefully preserved, and a note in McCullough's handwriting, "The ghost still walks. The hunt continues. Merry Christmas, Marshal." Cooper moved to the window, searching the snow-covered street for signs of the visitor. But there was nothing to see. No footprints marring the fresh snow, no shadowy figure disappearing into the night. Only the peaceful town sleeping under winter's blanket, safe and secure in ways it had never been before. Somewhere out there, beyond sight or sound, the ghost who walks continued his solitary mission. Not the fat rancher others had underestimated, not the simple homesteader seeking peace, but the legend reborn, the hunter unleashed, the justice that came without warning to those who believed themselves beyond reach of law. Cooper smiled, tucking the arrowhead into his pocket alongside McCullough's scout journal. The badge on his chest and the book at his side represented two faces of the same commitment, one public, one shadow, both necessary. Peace had returned to Crow's Creek, and, whether visible or not, the ghost would ensure it remained. The end.